സംസാരിക്കാനായിട്ട് നമ്മളോട് സംസാരിക്കാനായിട്ട് എത്തിയിട്ടുള്ളത് ഇൻഫെക്ഷസ് ഡിസീസ് ഡിപ്പാർട്ട്മെന്റിന്റെ HOD ആയിട്ടുള്ള അരവിന്ദ് സാറാണ്. സാറിനെ നമുക്ക് വളരെ സ്നേഹത്തോടുകൂടി സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യാം. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. I think it is your new venture, no? Evidence-based medicine lecture series and all. So I would like to thank. You are not HSA association now, no? Non-academic GS for this opportunity. എല്ലാരും മ്യൂട്ട് ചെയ്യാമോ? Okay, thank you. Host എല്ലാരും മ്യൂട്ട് ചെയ്താൽ മതി. Okay, so I've been asked to touch upon the basics of the clinical management of COVID-19. And I know that over the last 1 year, all of you as house surgeons were actively involved in the care of COVID-19 patients. And many people, the residents, etc., told me that since you are totally embroiled in the care of COVID-19 patients, you could not learn much and all. But then I would like look at that juncture, because now we are facing a pandemic for the first time in our lives. Now there is a lot to learn from that. So the clinical medicine is not about what you learn from the textbooks, no, because even though you did mention about evidence-based medicine, for evidence to be gathered, it takes time. It takes good quality randomized controlled trials to generate good quality evidence. So when we talk about the treatment of malaria or enteric fever or leptospirosis like that, all these things did come out of randomized controlled trials, which take years. But in a pandemic-like situation, we know that we don't have time. So we need to react fast, or else we'll lose lives. You have seen what happened during the first wave in Europe and USA, etc., because they were waiting for evidence to be gathered, and only after recovery trial, they started using steroids. Now we know that there are only 1 or 2 drugs which are really life-saving in the setting of COVID-19. One is actually the timely use of steroids, and second is the use of anticoagulants. All other drugs, may it be hydroxychloroquine to begin with, or say lopinavir, ritonavir, now even remdesivir and all those things, that's not backed by enough high-quality evidence. Remdesivir, what does the evidence say? That it can actually bring down the hospitalization. That's the ICU stay can be brought down by 3 days if you are using remdesivir. If you are using remdesivir, the average stay in the ICU can be brought down from 15 days to 11 days. It does not have any mortality benefit. So having said so, the issue with steroids is that suppose we start using steroids for all patients, because what I have been trying to convey is that the steroids are the life-saving drugs. Then what will happen? Then situations like this, COVID-associated mucormycosis will occur. So it is basically about the risk versus benefit analysis. So for the rest of your career also, you should actually think about what happened during the last 1 year. Okay, the number of articles which got published even in reputed journals, which had to be retraced and all. Now, even Lancet and NEJM, etc., had to some of the articles had to be erased from their site. So all these things do occur during a pandemic. Okay. Having said that, I'll go to the topic proper. Actually, Kalyani, can you enable me to share the screen? You can make me the co-host. You can make me the co-host so that I can share the screen. Okay, thank you. Are the slides visible? Are the slides visible?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so basically we know that the treatment guidelines in COVID-19 have been revised from time to time, and the Kerala guidelines were revised on April 25. Ours is the version 3. So before taking you through the guidelines, you should know what is actually happening with regard to the etiopathogenesis of COVID-19. Okay, so what you call the SARS-CoV-2 virus infection. Only if you know the pathogenesis, you will be able to understand the role of the different drugs in the different stages of the disease. you know that it is the receptor binding domain present in the spike protein. It's a very, very important thing. There's the binding domain, and the spike protein has to bind to the ACE2 receptor in the mammalian, in the host cell. There is the ACE2 receptor. The ACE2 receptor is present not only in the nasal epithelium, is not only present in the type 2 pneumocytes, is present in the myocardium, it is present in the blood-brain barrier, is actually present in the hepatocytes, in the renal tubular cells, intestine, etc. That is why you are having extrapulmonary manifestations in COVID-19. It is also present in endothelium, the reason why you are having more risk of thromboinflammation. For the spike protein to bind to this, ACE2 receptor, you require the help of something known as a co-receptor, that is TMPR SS2 is there. Okay, so this TMPR SS2 will activate the spike protein and will enhance the binding of the spike protein to ACE2 receptor, and then it also helps in cleaving this ACE2 receptor, and then the endocytosis will occur. And once the endocytosis occurs, this RNA is actually released, and there is the replication of the virus inside the host cell, and the virions are getting released. So initially, if you remember correctly, there were studies saying that there are suggestions that those on AC inhibitors, the ACE2 receptors will be upregulated when you are using AC inhibitors. Are they at increased risk of developing COVID-19? Because when ACE2 receptors are expressed in more numbers, what will happen? There will be more amount of ACE2 receptors for the spike protein to bind. But later studies did show that those patients on AC inhibitors and ARB, etc., they are not having more risk. Why? Because for the spike protein to bind to this ACE2 receptor, you require the co-receptor as well. That is the TMPR SS2. This is also very, very important. When we are using AC inhibitors and all, there is no increased expression of this TMPR SS2. And that is the reason why even in patients who are you are using AC inhibitor, the risk of getting the SARS-CoV-2 infection is same as those who are not on AC inhibitors. And this is actually the early stage of COVID-19. Once the SARS-CoV-2 virus binds to the ACE2 receptor in the type 2 pneumocytes, then what will happen is that the replication occurs and the virions are getting released, and there is actually the activation of the inflammatory system. The T lymphocytes, the monocytes, and neutrophils get activated, the macrophages get activated, and there is the release of the TNF alpha, the interleukin 1, as well as the interleukin 6. That is, the cytokines are getting released. And in the capillary endothelium also, you are having the ACE2 receptor, and there is an endotheliitis occurring. So if you take the natural history of SARS-CoV-2 infection, usually during the first 7 days, the viral replication and these sort of inflammatory responses are occurring. It's actually from the day 8 onwards, you're going to see the exaggerated inflammatory response. Okay, but keep one thing in mind. The majority of the patients, that is in Kerala, 96% of the patients are going to have only mild infection, or 40% are having asymptomatic infection. Total 96% are having mild infection only. So these sort of the hyperinflammatory response is going to happen only in the rest 4%, and it is our ability to identify those 4% of patients who will progress to hypoxia. The rest 96% does not require any treatment at all. Okay, they do not require any azithromycin, they do not require vitamin C or vitamin zinc. They need to be educated about the red flag signs. So the ability of a doctor is actually to treat without any drugs. We need to educate the patients about the red flag signs. They can be at home and they need to monitor themselves. Our ability depends on identifying that 4% of patients who are likely to progress to hypoxia. So this is actually what happens during the early stage of COVID-19. Now, in that 4%, the inflammation will progress. Okay, so what happens is that there is thickening of the interstitium. This is what happens first in patients who are going to develop pneumonia. First, what happens is there is infiltration of the mononuclear cells into the interstitium, and there is interstitial thickening. So when there is interstitial thickening, what will be the clinical sign? The patient will be having the dry cough-like thing. That is why when patients complain of dry cough, we are a bit worried. That means that the patient is having signs of interstitial infiltration, interstitial edema, and interstitial thickening. If you are measuring the saturation of the patient in this stage, what will it be like? Saturation will be normal. Resting desaturation will occur only when the alveoli is full of exudates. Okay, so at the stage of interstitial infiltration, interstitial edema, the resting desaturation is not there. In order to identify this stage, you need to do the 6-minute walk test. Okay, when you're doing the 6-minute walk test, there is going to be, in patients with interstitial edema, there is going to be a demand supply mismatch. Suppose at the start of this 6-minute walk test, your saturation is at 98 and you are walking for 6 minutes at your own pace, and then you are rechecking your saturation. If that saturation has fallen by 3, that means that there is interstitial edema. And it is at this juncture that you need to start on the right dose of steroids. You need to identify patients at the stage of interstitial edema itself. Okay. Suppose we are not identifying at this stage, then what will happen? The fluid, because of increased capillary permeability, will exude into the alveoli. And the alveoli will get filled with the fluids, and there is going to be influx of monocytes as well as neutrophils. Okay. And it is at this stage that the patient is going to develop resting desaturation. So in this second way, we know that we are having a scarcity of oxygen beds. So ICU beds, etc., we may not be able to provide at the drop of a hat. So basically, we need to buy time. So we need to identify patients at the stage of interstitial infiltration. We don't want the patients to progress to the stage of alveolar consolidation. Okay, so rely on the 6-minute walk test. Then the next pathophysiology is the activation of the coagulation cascade. This is actually what differentiates COVID-19 from other viral pneumonias or other atypical pneumonias. So H1N1 is also a bronchopneumonia. It's also interstitial pneumonia, but then there is no excess of activation of the coagulation cascade in H1N1. So basically, COVID-19 is H1N1 plus activation of the coagulation cascade, which results in microvascular, arterial, as well as venous thrombosis. Okay, why this is occurring? Because in the endothelium also expresses the ACE2 receptor. And you look at what is happening to the T lymphocytes. There is a T lymphocyte apoptosis. So more severe the infection, there is more amount of T lymphocyte apoptosis. That is the reason why we are having lymphocytopenia in COVID-19. Usually in a viral infection, you are seeing lymphocytosis. So COVID is an exception. COVID, there is lymphocytopenia. Lesser the number of lymphocytes, worse is going to be the prognosis. If your absolute lymphocyte count is less than 800, your outcome is also going to be bad. Why lymphocytopenia is occurring? Is because of increased T lymphocyte apoptosis. Now we are having studies saying that the ratio CD4 to CD8 is predictive of bad outcomes. So in short, you should know the basic pathophysiology in COVID-19 leading to the development of severe disease is endothelial barrier disruption plus dysfunctional alveolar capillary oxygen transmission plus impaired oxygen diffusion capacity and fulminant activation of coagulation and inhibition of fibrinolysis. So if you want me to say 2 drugs which are going to save the life of any patient, okay, it is going to be the timely administration of steroids at the time of exertional desaturation. Okay, and then in patients with hypoxia, there is this activation of coagulation cascade, and those patients should be put on standard prophylactic dose of anticoagulants. Okay, I think it is clear from the pathophysiology, the need for giving steroids as well as the need for giving anticoagulants at the right dose. This is basically the guidelines, the version 3 of the state guidelines, which was published in April 25. All of you should go through this guideline. This is a 78-page document. You can see there are 13 chapters. Okay. So it includes the pediatric aspect as well as the critical care guidelines. At your free time, you should go through these guidelines. Everything is described clearly, the why the one drug has been preferred over the other drug, etc. And the most important aspect of this guideline, okay, in difference to the other guidelines, is you look at the chapter 13, that is optimization of glycemic status in patients with diabetes and COVID-19. So we were forced to include this chapter because you know that you have been working in the wards, you have been working in the ICUs. So what is the most difficult thing to achieve in a patient with COVID-19 and diabetes? It is actually optimization of glycemic control. If glycemic control is not optimized, the outcomes due to COVID-19 is also going to be bad. And now you know the outcome of a patient with a uncontrolled diabetes is going to be probably they are becoming more susceptible to development of invasive fungal infections like aspergillosis as well as mucormycosis. So why this dysglycemia is occurring? Because of COVID-19 per se. Now, even in patients who have been euglycemics, COVID-19, since the pancreatic beta cells also express this ACE2 receptor as well as the co-receptor, there is a decrease in insulin secretion during COVID-19, and during the phase of cytokine storm, you're going to get insulin resistance as well. Then obviously the addition of steroids that can also drive up the insulin requirement. This is something you should clearly know. These are the NICE guidelines. So what is meant by an acute COVID-19? Many think that once the antigen is negative, we are not doing the exit rat now for mild to moderate COVID-19. Many think that once the rat is negative, then it is not COVID-19. It is not like that. So acute COVID-19 is signs and symptoms persisting for up to 4 weeks is acute COVID-19. From 1 month to actually something happened to my net connection. I'll be back. Am I audible? Am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay, something happened to my net connection. Okay. So am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So ongoing symptomatic COVID-19 is symptoms lasting from 4 weeks to 12 weeks. That is from 1 to 3 months. If symptoms are persisting, you will term it as the ongoing symptomatic COVID-19. And then post-COVID syndrome is those symptoms and signs persisting after 3 months. So once the antigen is negative after 10 days, and then if the patient is coming back with dyspnea, you should not term it as a post-COVID syndrome. Okay. So it is actually acute COVID-19 till 1 month. From 1 to 3 months, it is going to be ongoing symptomatic COVID-19. Why is it so? It is because the viral replication is triggering off a set of cytokine responses, and that can persist for up to 3 months. Okay. Now you have the case definition into a probable case as well as a proven case. Now we know in the current juncture during the second wave, we are dealing with the UK strain, and 60% of our isolates now belong to this double mutant or the B6172, which is highly transmissible. So in the current juncture, any patient presenting with anything is likely to be COVID-19. Okay. A proven case is one which has been proven by antigen testing or by RT-PCR. Now, this also you should know the typical manifestations. Any patient who is presenting with a stroke in young, multivessel or large vessel stroke, Kawasaki-like illness, multisystem inflammatory syndrome, hyperinflammatory shock, toxic shock syndrome like illness in children, acute MI, Guillain-Barré syndrome, viral encephalitis, ADEM, olfactory or gustatory dysfunction, conjunctivitis, etc. Also, you need to suspect COVID-19. Basically, in the current scenario, any patient presenting with any symptom, you need to think about COVID-19. Some patient presenting with exanthematous fever, please do rule out COVID-19. Presenting with conjunctivitis alone, please do rule out COVID-19. We know it is a bronchopneumonia with thromboinflammation. All these are manifestations of thromboinflammation. So you have to rule out COVID-19 in all these junctures. Now, what is actually happening to the lung? We are discussed. It is viral pneumonia plus thromboinflammation. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Basically, it is viral pneumonia with thromboinflammation. So it can affect actually all parts of the respiratory tracts. It can affect the conducting airways, the respiratory airways, alveoli, can lead to consolidation. It can affect the pulmonary blood flow, the interstitium, the neuromuscular breathing apparatus, as well as the pulmonary vascular endothelium. You should keep this in mind. And this is something known as the domino effect. So the first week, it is the phase of viral replication, followed by the phase where our body is or our immune system is trying to fight back against the virus. That is the stage of the cytokine storm. So the hallmark of a severe COVID-19 is immune dysregulation, indususceptive endotheliitis, which is leading on to this thromboinflammation and venous as well as arterial thrombosis, and the activation of the coagulation cascade. And why some patients are going to develop, especially the young females, are having lingering symptoms like headache, myalgia, fatigability, etc., which may persist for months together. It is due to the diverse functional autoantibodies in patients with COVID-19. So basically, in those patients, in 96% of patients, it is a self-limiting illness, do not require any treatment. In 4%, this is what is going to happen. The viral replication is going to trigger of a chain or a cascade of autoimmune responses, can result in immune dysregulation, endotheliitis, and activation of the coagulation cascade. This was what I was alluding to. The ACE2 receptor is present in multiple organ systems. You can have this thromboembolism, this DVT, the pulmonary embolism, or say catheter-related thrombosis. You can have this myocarditis. You can have bradycardia. You can have this Takotsubo cardiomyopathy or the stress cardiomyopathy. You can have all sorts of arrhythmias as well as cardiogenic shock and myocardial infarction. Endocrine axis, we have discussed hyperglycemia as well as the progression of diabetic ketoacidosis. You can have so many dermatological manifestations. The neurological manifestations, apart from anosmia, dysgeusia, are the development of encephalitis, the stroke syndromes, as well as the transverse myelitis or Guillain-Barré syndrome. You can have acute kidney injury, you can have transaminitis, and you can have a presentation with diarrhea. Now coming to the treatment per se, it depends on three aspects. One is the risk stratification. We need to identify those patients who are likely to progress to severe disease. Second is the severity staging. Third is the drug availability. So drug availability is also important because we need to have customized protocols and customized guidelines. So some drug which may not be available in India, there is no point in putting it in our guideline. Okay. So I think you are familiar with the categorization into A, B, and C. We are not using this categorization into A, B, and C for a decision making. It is actually for, for administrative purposes to allocate the patients to different centers like the CFLTC, CSLTC, etc. So category A, so only Kerala is having the categorization in the ABC. So we started it around say 1.5 years back because this is actually similar to the category ABC classification of influenza. No? So when we are making a guideline, so it should resonate with all the healthcare workers in Kerala, that is ASHA workers, everyone. So they are familiar with the influenza guidelines. So we thought of piggybacking into the influenza guidelines. During a pandemic is always trying to, we should try to come out with guidelines or categorization with which the ground level workers are already familiar with. Category A is mild sore throat, cough, rhinitis, diarrhea, or anosmia. If there is fever to category A, it is category B, or the presence of symptoms in those patients with comorbidities, like say lung disease, heart disease, liver, kidney, and all those things you know. And people above 60 years and pregnant ladies are also put under, the category B if they are symptomatic. Category C, we need to know about category C. These are the red flag signs. Patients who are dyspneic, who present with chest pain, drowsiness, hypotension, hemoptysis, cyanosis. These are the red flag signs. And children, inability to feed well, convulsions, etc. So these patients should be immediately hospitalized. For the treatment purpose, you should know the severity staging into mild, moderate, and severe. So mild is respiratory rate less than 24 per minute and SpO2 more than 94. Moderate is SpO2 between 91 and 94 and respiratory rate between 24 and 29. Severe is respiratory rate more than 30 and saturation less than 90. So you should know this. Suppose the patient's saturation is at 95. Okay, so it will belong to the mild category. But if you look at the respiratory rate, if it is at 28, what does that mean? In order to maintain that saturation of 95, the patient has to increase the work of breathing. Means that the patient will fall into moderate category. If the patient is in moderate category, the patient should be started on steroids as well as anticoagulants. So when you are using the pulse oximeter, please do have a look at the work of breathing as well, because many patients will be able to maintain a very good saturation by increasing the work of breathing. But then after a particular point of time, the respiratory compensation will not occur and the patient may desaturate rapidly. So please keep in mind this thing. Please don't focus on the saturation alone. Please have a look at the work of breathing also. And this is the ideal 5-tier of COVID-19 care pyramid of Kerala. Ideally, only the asymptomatics are supposed to be at home. And if they don't have access to a single room with an attached bathroom, then these patients will be taken to domiciliary care center. And the category A patient should be in CFLTC, the category B in the CSLTC, and the category C in designated COVID hospitals like the medical college or the general hospital. But unfortunately, we know that in the second wave, this is what actually we followed during the first wave. The second wave, we had such a huge surge in the number of patients. So we know that there are scenarios where even category B patients are also in home care. Okay, so we came out with the empowered home care guidelines. So we need to know about. So the RT is not only about treating that 4% who require hospitalization. RT is in identifying that 96% of patients who does not require any care at all. They just require proper IEC. We need to educate them about the red flag signs. We need to educate them about how to use the pulse oximeter properly. If they don't have access to pulse oximeter, we should educate them on the alternative to pulse oximeter, that is a deep breath test. Okay, so these are patients who are in home care, and these patients are ideally followed up by telephonically by the PHCMO. And we should also train them about self-assessment of symptoms, and if they do have access to pulse oximetry, we should teach them when they should report to us. That is, if the SpO2 is less than 94, they should report to the hospital. Okay. And the red flag signs is very important. So a patient is coming to you with, say, category A symptoms. We should educate them about the red flag signs. If red flag signs are there, they should be hospitalized. Okay. What are the red flag signs? Breathlessness is a red flag sign. Chest pain is a red flag sign. Drowsiness, definitely. Hemoptysis, syncope, palpitation. There is no doubt about these sort of things. But then we should pay attention to the two other things, that is excessive fatigability and alteration of sensorium. Okay, this is very, very important. Why excessive fatigability and alteration of sensorium? Alteration of sensorium is actually a reflection of the decreased cerebral perfusion. If the patient is in home care, we don't know whether they are having dyselectrolytemia because we will not be able to check that. But take it as an evidence of cerebral hypoperfusion, altered sensorium, and those patients should be admitted. What about excessive fatigability? Excessive fatigability is a sign of cellular hypoxia. Such patients also should be admitted because we know that in Kerala, only around 30% of the patients are having fever. Even people who are dying, they are not having fever. So we cannot take, say, fever as a clear-cut sign. Without fever, only those patients with fever will die, nothing like that. Okay. So we should focus while doing the death audit, especially elderly and those with comorbidities like CKD. A surrogate marker of bad outcome was excessive fatigability. Those who complained about excessive fatigability, the outcomes were bad. So you should keep these two things in mind. Anyone who is complaining of excessive fatigability. So what do you mean by this excessive fatigability? It is such a subjective thing. No? So suppose compared to yesterday, today I am feeling very, very, tired. Take it as excessive fatigability. Okay. And if I am unable to, I am not feeling like getting from bed and out, take it as excessive fatigability. And then as part of the empowered home care, we have come out with two things. There is one is the red category as well as the yellow category. Ideally, all the patients with the red flag signs should be hospitalized. But during the second wave, during the peak of the second wave and all, we had problems in allocating beds, okay, to all the patients with red flag signs. So we need to categorize them again into red category and yellow category. So red category means those patients should be immediately hospitalized. Okay. Yellow category means you can buy time by starting steroids at home. Suppose you are having, say, in the medical college, you are having, say, 5 oxygen beds now, and you are getting, say, 15 calls, and all the 15 of them are having the red flag signs. Okay, so you need to identify those 5 patients who should be immediately hospitalized. Okay, for that you categorize them again. That is, those patients with red flag signs should again be categorized into red category and yellow category. So what is this red category? Suppose you are doing a telephonic consult. the patient is so breathless that the patient is unable to speak a few words or complete a sentence, that is a red category, should immediately be hospitalized. Or the patient is having a dyspnea over the last 1 to 2 days, but over the last 1 hour, it has suddenly deteriorated. Try to hospitalize the patient immediately. Okay, patient is complaining of resting desaturation, that is breathlessness at rest. But breathlessness at rest means that the patient is having consolidation, alveolar exudation, should immediately be hospitalized. Sudden onset of breathlessness after 7 days means that the viral replication phase is over and the patient is into the cytokine storm. Immediately hospitalized. If the patient is having pulse oximeter in saturation less than 94 at rest, immediately hospitalized. But the problem is that majority of the patients may not be having access to pulse oximeter now, and it may not be able to buy a pulse oximeter also, because there are certain issues with availability now. So teach them about the single breath holding test. It is a poor man's alternative to the pulse oximetry. Okay, that is, you are supposed to take a deep breath, not a very deep breath. Try to take a deep breath and see for how long you will be able to hold the breath. If it is more than 25 seconds, means that you are having a very good cardiopulmonary reserve. If it is between 15 and 25 seconds, you are having a limited reserve. You fall into the yellow category. It is less than 15 seconds, you fall into the red category. Means that you are having a very poor cardiopulmonary reserve. The problem here is that suppose an asthmatic may, because of asthma itself, they may not be able to hold the breath properly. So what we should do is, from day 1 of isolation at home, we should ask them to do the single breath holding test if they don't have access to a pulse oximeter. And then you assess, maybe on day 1 they may be able to hold for 30 seconds. By day 7, suppose they are able to hold only for say 20 seconds, that means that there is a problem. Okay. Second is how to assess the Second is how to assess the circulatory function. Okay, how to assess the presence of shock or peripheral shutdown in a patient who is in isolation. Suppose the patient is having a new onset of confusion or reduced level of consciousness, that means that there is a sign of cerebral hypoperfusion. Suppose the bystander or the patient is saying that my extremities are very cold to touch. Okay, that patient should be hospitalized. If the bystander is saying that the patient is looking very pale, should be hospitalized. And if the patient is saying that over the last 24 hours, my urine output has come down, it is also a marker of, a circulatory issue. Such patients should be hospitalized. Then, if there is functional impairment, Alzheimer's and all, such patients should be hospitalized. And patients with serious other issues like say cardiomyopathy, CKD, CLD, it's better to hospitalize all those patients. Okay, if patients meet any one or more of the above criteria, they need to contact Disha and they should be transferred to a COVID hospital at the earliest. That is, your 15 beds, allocate that 5 bed. Out of the 5 beds, give 1 bed to this patient. Now, we need to identify the yellow category. Yellow category means that by starting steroids and oral anticoagulants at home, you can buy time. Probably, the patient may not require hospitalization, or probably you may be able to buy time. So it may be hours or it may be days. By that time, we may be able to arrange a bed for them. So will you identify this yellow category? The breathing, which has worsened in the last 24 hours. Okay, that is, it's a slow worsening. Second is that patient is complaining of exertional breathlessness. Okay, not resting breathlessness. Resting desaturation means you need to be hospitalized at the earliest. Exertional desaturation means that the interstitial inflammation is beginning. Probably by starting steroids at this juncture, you may be able to buy some time. Then, suppose the patient is an asthmatic, maybe using 1 puff BD. If the requirement is 2 puff BD, such patients also should be started on oral steroids. And then, if you have an access to the pulse oximeter, the saturation is more than 94 at room air. But then, if you do a 6-minute walk test, if there is a 3% fall from baseline, such patients should be started on oral steroids. Okay. And then, if the single breath holding is between 15 and 25 seconds, if the patient belongs to this yellow category, you start the patient on oral steroids as well as oral anticoagulants. So this is basically the algorithm for an empowered home care. Any patient with red flag signs, you reassess the patient to see whether the patient will fall into yellow category or red category. Even yellow category patients who have other risk factors like uncontrolled diabetes, like obesity and all, they should be hospitalized. Okay, if they're having signs or symptoms fitting them into red category, immediately hospitalize the patient. Otherwise, all the yellow category patients can be started on oral steroids. And you should pay attention to the dose of oral steroids. This dexamethasone 8 milligram per day, or prednisolone 32 milligram per day, that is 16 milligram BD, or Visalon, prednisolone 40 milligram per day for 7 to 10 days. It's very, very important. This is the dose of steroids and is equivalent used in the recovery trial. If the patient is hypoxic, the patient might require oral anticoagulants also. So it could be rivaroxaban 10 milligram OD or apixaban 5 milligram BD. And if oral anticoagulants are not available, the alternative could be aspirin 75 milligram per day. It is not backed by any studies, but rather than giving no anticoagulant, it will be better to start at least aspirin. Okay. Before starting anticoagulation, you need to look at the contraindication for anticoagulation, because we are going to start a patient at home, anticoagulation at home, and we don't have access to any monitoring mechanism. If there is evidence of active bleeding, if there is evidence of malignant hypertension, if there is evidence of severe liver disease, if there is evidence of hemophilia, etc., you should not start the patient on oral anticoagulation. Then, if you are starting and if there is thrombocytopenia with platelet count less than 25,000, okay. And the next important thing is that in patients with who have been started on oral steroids, you need to reassess them every 12 hours to see whether they are progressing to red category. This is also very, very important. Now coming to those patients we are hospitalizing. So we have identified those patients who require hospitalization, and we have brought them to the hospital, and then you need to risk stratify the patient. It is based on the comorbidities, the presence of uncontrolled diabetes, that is HbA1c more than 7.6, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, a chronic lung disease, CKD, CLD, HIV, etc., age above 60 years, and obesity. Obesity is also a risk factor. You know that in youngsters without any other comorbidities, obesity is a risk factor, and because of obesity itself, the patient can worsen. Then the clinical assessment is based on the saturation at rest less than 94%, tachycardia, the respiratory rate, and presence of hypotension or altered sensorium, and the lab values which can predict the progression to severe disease, okay, or modes, are a CRP more than 100 milligram per liter, the CPK twice upper limit of normal. If the patient is complaining of severe myalgia, definitely you should check the CPK, because we have seen patients with a CPK more than 20,000, and that can lead to rhabdomyolysis as well as acute kidney injury. Then ferritin, you know that ferritin is an inflammatory marker. If the value is more than 300, probably it is an evidence of hyperinflammation going on. TROP-T elevation as well as a BNP elevation will give a clue towards myocarditis. LDH, which is a marker of tissue hypoxia. Then D-dimer. D-dimer is very, very important. If it is more than 1000 nanogram per ml, means that the prognosis is going to be bad, and definitely the patient has to be on anticoagulation. So this is actually not from our guideline. This is actually from the US FDA guidelines. Basically, those patients asymptomatic, there is no need for treatment. So the category A patient or mild severity, there is no need for any treatment. In those patients with comorbidities, in symptomatic patients with comorbidities, that is, suppose a patient with a BMI of 40 is coming to you, or a CKD or a CLD patient is coming to you with mild symptoms now. We know that this category of patients are likely to progress to a severe disease, and then the outcomes may not be pretty good. And in USA, they have this emergency use authorization for the monoclonal antibodies, that is bevacizumab as well as casirivimab plus imdevimab. And you know that recently the DCGI did give approval for using the casirivimab plus imdevimab. It is actually a cocktail of monoclonal antibodies marketed by Roche. So it is available in India. It is available in Kerala as well. It is not a part of the national guidelines because each injection will cost around 60,000 rupees. The patient requires just one injection. Okay. Once the patient is in hypoxia, there is no role for monoclonal antibody cocktail. So what is the role of monoclonal antibody cocktail? Any patient with risk factors which may suggest progression to severity. Okay. A transplant patient now coming with COVID-19, mild symptoms now to begin with, but after 7 days, the patient may progress to pneumonia. So this is the right candidate on whom we should be giving monoclonal antibodies. So that is one thing. The second is all the hospitalized patients. In USA, the hospitalization, only those with desaturation are hospitalized. all the hospitalized patients are given injection remdesivir. Our guidelines also, the indication for giving remdesivir is desaturation. Any SpO2 less than 94% in room air is an indication for giving the antiviral drug remdesivir. Convalescent plasma, the ICMR has taken a convalescent plasma out of the guidelines, so there is no point in discussing about convalescent plasma now. And in patients who are having hypoxia, we need to start them on dexamethasone. If on dexamethasone, the inflammatory markers are improving, are not improving, and if the patient is desaturating, then you can consider addition of the monoclonal, addition of the IL-6 receptor antagonist, that is tocilizumab. We do have access to tocilizumab as well. And then the last drug, that is a baricitinib plus remdesivir, is an active trial. So baricitinib plus remdesivir also did have some sort of a the mortality benefit. Baricitinib, it is a JAK1. You have the JAK pathway, Janus kinase inhibitor 1, 2, 3. So we have the JAK inhibitors also in the market now. It's not very expensive. So baricitinib costs around say 15 rupees, and the duration of treatment is 14 days. So ideally, when will we give baricitinib? Patients, cannot tolerate dexamethasone. There are contraindications to use of dexamethasone, say like an active bleeding ulcer, or suppose with the dose of dexamethasone, we are not able to bring down hypoxia, the inflammatory markers are elevating, and the patient is a diabetic. We are not able to control the blood sugars by increasing. So if you are increasing the steroid dose, we may not be able to control the blood sugar levels. In such settings, you can think about adding baricitinib, which is a JAK1/2 inhibitor. And this is basically the state guidelines. For category A patients, asymptomatic patient, you just require monitoring. Okay. For category A patients, just symptomatic treatment. Symptomatic treatment is not azithromycin or say vitamin C or say zinc. Symptomatic treatment means for fever giving paracetamol, or say for rhinitis giving cetirizine. That is symptomatic treatment. You should not use an antibiotic to treat a viral pneumonia. Okay. The second thing is zinc, vitamin C, and all. In multiple trials, there is no benefit by giving zinc and vitamin C. And also, the problem with zinc, there is a issue of COVID-associated mucormycosis, and you know that the fungi that's mucormycosis, require iron for its growth, and majority of the fungi also require zinc for its growth. Why should we be feeding fungi with extrinsic zinc? We should not be doing that. So the symptomatic treatment is about giving paracetamol as well as using cetirizine. It's not about giving azithromycin. It's not about giving vitamin C. Vitamin C is innocuous. There is no harm in giving vitamin C, but try not to give zinc for these patients. Okay. But then all these patients should be monitored for red flag signs. Category B patients, the national guidelines say that give ivermectin 12 milligram once a day for 3 to 5 days if risk factors are present. So you know that category B is there is patients with fever are category B, and those patients with the risk factors are also category B. Those patients with risk factor, ivermectin 12 milligram can be given for 3 to 5 days, but it is not backed by high quality evidence. Okay, so it's not binding on you to prescribe ivermectin, and ivermectin is not having any mortality benefit also. But then any patient with fever and cough persisting more than 5 days, and there is no desaturation, exertion, or resting, you start them on budesonide, which is backed by the STOIC trial. Okay, budesonide 800 microgram BD for around 5 to 7 days. Now coming to category C patients, the options are giving favipiravir for 7 days is 1800 milligram BD, followed by 800 BD for total of 7 days, or if it is not available, ivermectin plus budesonide. Now coming to the category C patients with hypoxia, you again divide them into moderate and severe. Moderate is, the definition, saturation between 91 and 94. Severe is saturation less than 90. Here the mainstay is starting them on steroids. The dose is either prednisolone or dexamethasone. You can select either. For moderate, dexamethasone 0.1 to 0.2 mg per kg per day. For severe, it is 0.2 to 0.4. Either prednisolone 0.5 to 1 and 1 to 2. So these drugs are the mainstay of treatment of those patients with hypoxia. Okay, so even if you forget about favipiravir, it is not backed by very good quality trials. Ivermectin is not at all backed by any high quality evidence. Budesonide, probably it might help in those patients without desaturation, those with dry cough and fever for around 5 days. You can use budesonide. The most important drugs with mortality benefit definitely is going to be the timely initiation of steroids, that is methylprednisolone or dexamethasone along with anticoagulation. And if you are using ivermectin and favipiravir, they are not recommended in children. Okay. And now coming to remdesivir. So remdesivir, we know many people think that it is a magic bullet. It is actually an inhibitor of RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, just like favipiravir. Remdesivir has a very good trial to support its use. You know that WHO has taken the remdesivir out of its drug formulary even. They said the remdesivir should not be used. But then NIH and majority of the protocols do maintain remdesivir for those patients who are hypoxemic and those who are presenting within 10 days. Why this 10 days? This is the period during which viral replication occurs. Okay, after the period of viral replication, there is no point in giving an antiviral drug. So remdesivir is indicated in patients with hypoxia, should be given within 10 days. What are the contraindications? A creatinine clearance less than 30 and SGPT more than 5 times the upper limit of normal. Even in such situations, we can individualize and give remdesivir because it is not an absolute contraindication. Now coming to the role of ivermectin, it is to be given for those patients with risk factors for progression to severe disease, and it is based on very low certainty evidence and is recommended by AIMS as well as the ICMR National Task Force. The NIH guidelines. NIH is the National Institute of Health. That is actually the Anthony Fauci's organization. NIH guidelines. Okay, the guidelines which stick to almost all the high quality evidence is the NIH guidelines. The NIH guidelines take on ivermectin is they don't have enough evidence for or against the use of ivermectin in COVID-19. Okay, suppose you are using ivermectin, you should not be using it in children, you should not be using lactating ladies, you should not be using pregnancy. Okay, and the important thing is that you should never combine azithromycin with ivermectin because it is metabolized by the CYP3A4. Azithromycin will inhibit the CYP3A4 and can drive up the ivermectin levels, can lead to toxicity. Now coming to favipiravir, this drug is also not backed by any high quality evidence. If you are trying to use favipiravir, you should in a LRD belong to the reproductive age group. If you are contemplating using remdesivir or favipiravir, you need to rule out pregnancy. It can lead to teratogenicity, transaminitis, neutropenia, as well as hyperuricemia. Okay, and the contraindication is almost same as the contraindications for remdesivir. Creatinine clearance less than 30 and SGPT more than 5 times the upper limit of normal. Convalescent plasma, so it is out. So in the ICMR guidelines do not recommend using convalescent plasma in any setting now. Okay. Now this is another drug. Tocilizumab is actually a humanized IL-6 receptor antagonist. It does have benefit when it is given at a particular time point. Okay, tocilizumab, you must have seen us using tocilizumab in the ICUs. There has been a change in recommendation for using tocilizumab. Previously, we used to give it for, there is something known as a cytokine release syndrome 3 and 4. We used to categorize cytokine release syndrome into 1, 2, 3, and 4. Indication for tocilizumab was in 3 and 4. It was actually a very stringent guidelines. Okay. So by that time, the criteria are met, the patient will be very sick. And I know at that point, giving tocilizumab never used to benefit the patient. But now, following the REMAP-CAP and the recovery trial, the guidelines have changed. The indication is a recently hospitalized patient who have been admitted to ICU within prior 24 hours and who require NIV or HFNO. And the flow rate should be FiO2 0.4 and 30 liter of oxygen per minute. So that is situation you can give tocilizumab. That the patient has to be on steroids for 24 hours and patient is not improving, is on either HFN or NIV, give tocilizumab. Or a recently hospitalized patient with rapidly increasing oxygen requirement with highly elevated markers of inflammation like CRP. The dosage is 8 mg per kg IV. And then you need to look at the SGPT, SGOT, neutropenia can occur, thrombocytopenia can occur. The most important thing is that it is an IL-6 receptor antagonist. No, the chance of sepsis is around 2 times higher in patients who receive tocilizumab. The chance of candidemia is also 2 times higher in patients who receive tocilizumab. There is a chance of reactivation of TB in those who receive tocilizumab. So if you are administering tocilizumab, keep this in mind. So if the patient is developing, say, new infiltrates in the X-ray chest after, say, 2 weeks or so, it could be a reactivation of TB or it could be a fungal infection. Keep that in mind. And now we have already discussed, this is the state algorithm. So in our state, the indication for starting steroids is not resting desaturation. It is exertional desaturation. You do the 6-minute walk test. If the 6-minute walk test, if there is a 3% fall in saturation, at that point of time, start them on steroids. That is dexamethasone 8 milligram or methylprednisolone 32 milligram or Viceron 40 milligrams. Very important. And some points with regard to pregnancy. Ivermectin and favipiravir are contraindicated in pregnancy. So in remdesivir, we are using in moderate to severe SARS-CoV pneumonia in pregnancy as well on a compassionate basis. Okay. Steroids, the problem with the selection of steroids in pregnancy, because there is the placental enzyme 11-beta hydroxy dehydrogenase 2, which can metabolize methylprednisolone as well as Viceron. So if you want to give a steroid for fetal maturity, suppose the mother is 30 weeks pregnant, and if the hypoxia is worsening, you will go for termination. So you will need the lung maturity of the fetus as well, then give dexamethasone 4 doses followed by methylprednisolone. What will happen if you are going to continue with dexamethasone for 10 days, it will cross over to the fetus and can lead to adrenal suppression fetus. So what we do is that if you are contemplating termination also, for the first 2 days, give dexamethasone followed by methylprednisolone. Suppose it is a first trimester, then there is no need to give dexamethasone, okay, because you are not planning to terminate and all. Give methylprednisolone for 7 to 10 days. You know that pregnancy is a procoagulant situation. So all the admitted patients with COVID-19 and pregnancy should be put on prophylactic anticoagulation. And another thing is that the D-dimer cutoff for adults is, what is the cutoff? It is 500 now. But in pregnancy, you are going to have different cutoffs. So in first trimester, up to 1,200 could be normal. Second trimester, up to 3,200 could be normal. Third trimester, up to 3,300 could be normal. You should keep this in mind. And the pathophysiology of what is this CAHA? It is COVID-associated hemostatic abnormalities. We have discussed that. Endothelium expresses ACE2 receptor. So there is an insusceptible endotheliitis. There is an activation of the coagulation cascade. So there is a procoagulant milieu. Along with hypoxia, this can lead to macrovascular thrombosis like DVT or pulmonary embolism, and microvascular thrombosis, which can manifest as ARDS. So the patient should be put on. What is the dose of anticoagulant to be used? This is very, very important. Should they be on, say, prophylactic anticoagulation or therapeutic anticoagulation? So following this REMAP, CAP, ATTACK, as well as the ACTIV-4 trial, now we know that. So majority of the patients should be on prophylactic dose, that is standard dose prophylactic anticoagulation. So, and that is better or safer over intermediate or high dose intensity anticoagulation. Therapeutic anticoagulation should be reserved for patients with suspected or proven venous or arterial thrombosis. So in order to go for a therapeutic anticoagulation, you need not prove pulmonary embolism or need not prove DVT. Even if you are suspecting DVT or pulmonary embolism, you should switch over to therapeutic anticoagulation. So this is the algorithm, and I think that you can go through the state guidelines. You can read this algorithm, and based on this algorithm, you can select the dose of anticoagulation, whether it should be enoxaparin, say 0.5 mg per kg OD or BD, or 7 mg per kg OD or BD. Anyway, all these patients with an elevated D-dimer, say more than 3, should undergo this point of care ultrasound to rule out this DVT, as well as, if possible, should go for a CTPA to rule out pulmonary embolism. And we know that doing a CTPA may not be easy. So we know that doing a CTPA may not be easy. In such situation, take it as pulmonary embolism and go for therapeutic anticoagulation. Now the $1 million question is, when you are discharging a patient, okay, we have heard of patients who have been discharged, coming back after 2 weeks with myocardial infarction, coming back with stroke syndrome. Should all the patients be put on post-discharge thromboprophylaxis? Okay, but then we do have, we have actually millions of patients with COVID-19. A majority of them are not developing any thrombosis. So administration of this antithrombotic agents to all the patients with COVID-19 is actually not justified, because the number needed to treat to prevent one venous thromboembolism is actually going to be very high in those with mild severity COVID-19. Okay, so having said that, all patients who require therapeutic anticoagulation for DVT or embolism definitely require continuation of anticoagulation for 3 to 6 months. The other patients, the majority that you are seeing, those who have been on enoxaparin during hospitalization, the prophylactic dose, no evidence of embolism, no evidence of DVT. Should they be put on rivaroxaban or apixaban? So you can decide based on this score, that is the modified improved VTE risk score. So based on these factors, the presence of venous thromboembolism gets 3 points, thrombophilia 2 points, lower limb paralysis 2 points, cancer 2 points, immobilized for 7 days 1 point, stay in ICU 1 point, and age above 60 also 1 point. If the score is 4, equal to 4 or more than 4, give apixaban or rivaroxaban for 2 to 3 weeks. If the score is more than or equal to 2 and the D dimer is more than say 1000, it is 2 times the upper limit of normal, give apixaban or rivaroxaban for 2 to 3 weeks. And the common scenario is the score will be less than 2, but the D dimer will be more than 2 times the upper limit of normal. So in such situation, give aspirin even though it is not backed by evidence. And when to suspect embolism? This is very, very important. When you are taking ICU duty, suppose the hypoxia is not improving, the patient is having tachycardia, hypoxia is not improving with your steroids and usual oxygen supplementation, patient is having hypotension, patient is having tachycardia, and the D dimer levels are rapidly rising. There is 6 times elevation of D dimer. And the CT is not suggestive of worsening of COVID-19 pneumonia. In that juncture, think about voluntary embolism. Okay, this is not needed because convalescent plasma we have taken off the guideline. And then this is one entity, probably you must be aware of that is multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children as well as in adults. So what happens here is that, the SARS-CoV-2 infection could be a mild infection, and after around 25 days, so this virus, patient may not be aware of the initial infection, and this virus will act as a super antigen, can lead to the stimulation of the macrophages, the helper T cells, the B cells, and can lead to a very, very, very hyper-inflammatory response. And the patient can present with high-grade fever. That is actually 25 days later, or the 3 weeks after the initial mild COVID-19, the patient can present high-grade fever along with hypotension due to myocarditis, then acute kidney injury. Some patients present with abdominal pain and diarrhea. And if you are doing an ultrasound, there could be mesenteric lymphadenopathy, ileitis. Sometimes it may be misdiagnosed as appendicitis and all, maybe having erythema, the mucosal lesions and all. The most important thing is the majority of these patients present with high-grade fever and shock due to myocarditis, and patient is hypoxic not due to pneumonia, because usually the lungs are spared. They are hypoxic because of myocarditis. And you should know the working case definition. The pediatricians will never miss MISC because they are tuned with diagnosis of MISC. And following the first wave, we had around 70 cases of MISC in SAT, and the mortality was 0. And Calicut had around 100 cases and none of them died. But on the adult side, it is not easy to diagnose MISA, because if you look at the DDs, it could be, say, Wheel syndrome with MODS, or it could be a sepsis, or it could be autoimmune conditions like SLE. So you need to suspect MISA, only then you will be able to initiate steroids at the earliest. The treatment of MISA is not antibiotics, it is high dose of methylprednisolone. So this is the working case definition. Any severe illness in patients above 21. Less than 21 years, you call it as MISC, multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children. Above 21 years, you call it as MISC, multisystem inflammatory syndrome in adults. The second criteria is there should be an evidence of SARS-CoV-2 infection in the preceding 3 months. So it could be a positive PCR, means that it is a viral shedding now, or it could be an antibody test positivity. Okay, so usually these patients, the PCR will be negative, antigen will be negative. So the evidence of infection, suppose they are saying that someone in the family had SARS-CoV-2, then probably this patient also would have had it, or you do an antibody test, it will be positive. There should be dysfunction of one or more extrapulmonary organs, that is acute kidney injury or liver injury, or say encephalitis, thromboembolism, etc. The hallmark is that the inflammatory markers are very much elevated. That is, the CRP is very much elevated, ferritin is elevated, D dimer is elevated, and if you do have access to IL-6, that is also very much elevated. Sometimes the procalcitonin is also very much elevated. Then you will think that if the total count is say 30,000 with a procal of 100, you will think it is septic shock. The thing is that procal is also an inflammatory marker. And most important clue is patient is hypoxic, but hypoxemia is not due to pneumonia. It is due to myocarditis, and it is a diagnosis of exclusion, as we have already discussed. And the rule of the thumb is suspect MISA in any patient with leukocytosis, neutrophilia, and myocarditis presenting with fever with acute abdominal pain, diarrhea with or without hypotension, or high-grade unremitting fever with or without hypotension. Usually, the patient will be in hypotension and the count will be around 40,000. You will think it is septic shock, but the patient may not be having a foci for explaining this septic shock. In such situations, you rule out myocarditis. If myocarditis is present and CRP is very much elevated, D-dimer is very much elevated, think in terms of MISA, load the patient on methylprednisolone, which could be life-saving. This is one of our patients. You can see present with acute abdomen. No, we thought it is really acute abdomen, and the surgery was done. You can see the terminal ileum thickening. Okay, terminal ileum thickening is a classically described in MISA as well. And if the patient in the second or third week, and the patient is not improving, hypoxia is not improving, you are taking a CT, there is a nodular cavitating lesion, you need to tend and look at the history. Patient has been on steroids or has received tocilizumab. Think about the possibility of COVID-associated pulmonary aspergillosis or a reactivation of TB or a pulmonary mucormycosis. So you also know about this COVID-associated mucormycosis, and this is why I said that we should not be for mild COVID-19. So majority of the patient, 96% of the patients do not require any drug at all. Okay. If you are using medicines unscientifically, then the end result could be very disfiguring things like a mucormycosis. Why? We know that mucormycosis, India is the capital of diabetes mellitus, and India is actually sort of the capital of mucormycosis also. But this does not explain the fact that this COVID-associated mucormycosis is seen in such high incidence in India alone. No, mucormycosis is there in other countries as well. And we have diabetes patients in other countries as well. So why this is occurring? The major reason for COVID-associated mucormycosis is obviously uncontrolled diabetes mellitus. We know what is happening in our wards and all we know. It's very difficult to control our blood sugar levels. Along with that, we are giving steroids as well. And if the patient is in diabetic ketoacidosis, so because of the acidic pH, there will be more free iron available to the fungus. So when the free iron is available, the Rhizopus oryza will go on multiplying. It will attach to the glucose regulator GRP78, which gets expressed when the RBS is more than 200. Okay, and it can lead to invasive mucormycosis. This is one thing. The second aspect is that we are also having patients without history of diabetes, without history of steroids, who are presenting with mucormycosis, even though the number is a very, very less. So it is a truly multifactorial disease. So if you are using azithromycin, why are you prescribing azithromycin for a viral pneumonia on day one? You think that is going to prevent a bacterial superinfection? It is not going to do that. None of the antibiotics will prevent a bacterial superinfection. Bacterial superinfection usually occurs after day 10. After day 10, you are having fever. After day 10, if you are having, say, purulent expectoration, etc., probably at that time you can consider an antibiotic, not from day 1 onwards. So what will happen if you are giving antibiotics unscrupulously? Your nasal epithelium, it will be full of good bacteria. It will be wiped out by azithromycin. So usually we inhale the fungal spores. The spores of this zygomyces or Rhizopus is everywhere. It is ubiquitous. If you keep the bread out, the black thing is Rhizopus only. So we will be inhaling the spores. But our intact nasal epithelium, along with the bacteria which are colonized in the nasal epithelium, will prevent the fungus from proliferating. But if you are using unscientifically antibiotics, your good bacteria, the colonizers, will be lost and there won't be any competition for the fungus. Next is using this zinc. So we discussed zinc does not prevent the progression of COVID-19, does not bring down the duration of symptoms in COVID-19. So why should we be using zinc in such high doses? Also, zinc can drive the growth of fungus. So we should not be using zinc as well. We should not be using any unscientific medicines. We should be using steroids. Steroids are life-saving. Should be using steroids only when there is absolute indication. So reverse discharge criteria, So thank you very much for this opportunity and patiently listening to this. Amongst did say that many of you do have so many questions, and you should keep this thing in mind. So these are pictures of one patient who presented with a decreased visual acuity after recovering from COVID-19. This is a case of central retinal artery occlusion that can occur because of thromboinflammation. And we had multiple cases of patients coming with arterial as well as venous thrombosis for following COVID-19. So basically, COVID-19 is about a bronchopneumonia, interstitial pneumonia with thromboinflammation. Thank you very much.
So very good evening to all. I'd like to thank Aravind sir on behalf of the HSA and all the doctors who've been listening to this presentation. Because COVID is actually something we haven't expected to be involved or be a part of as part of doctor's life. And it is a disease of whose understanding is rapidly changing every single day. And so not many of us are in the practice of reading the new developments that are coming in. And all the management that we've done so far is basically modeled on what we have heard so far. So it was basically a hearsay. So I'd like to extend my gratitude to sir in this opportunity, wherein he has shed light on the aspects of the code treatment with respect to the new trial data that has been coming. Now we'd like to move on to questions if sir has the time for it. Sir, would you be free to take some questions?
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. So the doctors with the questions, could you please shout out a yes or something with your mic on, please, and we'll take the questions one by one.
Good evening, sir.
Meaning,
Sir, I'm Dr. Arsha M. Dev. First of all, thank you so much, sir, for this detailed class. It's really helpful for non-clinical residents like us while working on COVID wards. This class was really detailed. Hope I'm audible, sir.
you're audible. Go on.
Okay, sir. So I was a resident who was working in COVID ward till yesterday. So based on my observations, I have seen that hyponatremia is the most common electrolyte disturbance among the COVID-19 patients. So I did a small checking and I found that it is prevalent in many of the countries, hyponatremia. So being an aspiring physiologist, I would like to know the exact cause of hyponatremia developing among COVID-19 patients. Will you please substantiate it so that next time when we see such a case, we can approach it accordingly? Because we lost a patient due to hyponatremia and all the underlying causes of hyponatremia was ruled out because in CT, the patient has no such issues relating to that. And it was not because of any other issues. So she was having continuous hyponatremia for the past 7 days because we were continuously monitoring her sodium levels. Even this 3% NS and oral intake couldn't save her. So will you please substantiate on this electrolyte disturbance?
What was the age of the patient?
75, sir.
75. Did you rule out a renal tubular problem?
Yes, sir. She was not having any such issues. RFT was monitored.
What was the urea like?
Urea was around 26, 27. It was a normal range, sir.
Okay. And what was the volume status of the patient? Euvolemic or hypovolemic or hypervolemic?
The patient was not in hypovolemia or hypervolemia. She was absolutely fine for most of the time, and she was a bit disoriented in the last 2 days. That
Okay.
because of that CT was taken, sir, and all
What
the
was the saturation?
saturation was around 93%, 94%, sir, and the X-ray was
Okay.
also improving. There was
Improving.
when she was hospitalized for 20 days, there was features of pneumonia. And as we have seen that the X-ray was having a resolved pneumonia status.
Okay. Actually, the thing is, why did you say that the patient died of hyponatremia?
Because in continuous monitoring, we have seen that only sodium was deranged, nothing else. Even the D-dimer was improving. The status was improving in the case of D-dimer. No other investigations had gone deranged.
Okay. What was the sodium level?
When she was just before her death, I mean just some 3 hours before, the sodium level was around 107.
Just very low. Okay, you were not able to correct the level of hyponatremia. Okay.
Yes,
So,
sir. Yes, sir.
Usually we encounter hyponatremia in the elderly patients. In the young patients with COVID-19, we are not seeing hyponatremia to that extent.
Okay,
Since
sir.
you have said that you have ruled out all causes of hyponatremia, we need to rule out the cerebral causes of hyponatremia as well. Before saying
Okay,
that we have
sir.
ruled all the causes of hyponatremia, it was basically a refractory hyponatremia. Despite 3% saline, also you were not able to correct it. Okay. So since you said you have ruled out all causes, and I can't say why in this patient the hyponatremia was there. Definitely, we need to rule out, categorize the hyponatremia into euvolemic, hypolimic, as well as hypervolemic hyponatremia, and then we need to look at the renal wasting. And probably you said that you have done the urine sodium estimation, everything you have done now.
Yes, sir.
Everything, and still you are not able to find a cause for the same.
Yes.
Okay, then I don't know why this hyponatremia occurred in this patient. This is actually what I was also trying to allude to. Since we focused on hyperglycemia, so majority of the patients in our wards can be saved by supportive care. by correcting the electrolytes or by having a very good glycemic control, probably the patient can be saved. As Dr. Harsha was saying, her saturation was improving, her D-dimer was improving, everything was improving, and probably the patient died because of hyponatremia. And during this pandemic, these sort of things are happening because we are just going behind the COVID per se. Patient may be dying because of other factors as well. Okay. And I don't know why hyponatremia occurred in this patient. In elderly, hyponatremia is very well described in COVID-19.
Okay, sir. When shall I ask one more question?
Sure.
Okay, sir. So next time when we are seeing such a patient, how can we modify our approach?
The
Can
thing
you give
is
some
that
suggestions?
no. First of all, you need to look at any medications which are contributing to hyponatremia or hypokalemia. Usually, these patients may be on these thiazide diuretics, but then since bystanders are not there in our ward, we can't say that is the reason. Usually, if bystanders are there, they may be giving the usual drugs which may contain these thiazide diuretics, like say Losarach and all those things, and that is the commonest cause of hyponatremia in elderly we are encountering.
Okay, sir.
Usually, but then that does not apply to the patients admitted in the hospital since they don't have bystanders. Okay, they will get only the drugs that are prescribed by us. Second is you need to look at the volume status. So whether it is a euvolemic one or hypovolemic one or hypervolemic, and based on that we need to come with the diagnosis of hyponatremia. We need to rule out the urinary sodium as well as the potassium wasting, and ideally after sending all the investigation, you need to try correcting the sodium by a normal saline or 3% saline.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Any other questions? Any questions? So if there are no questions, I would like to say one thing. An ability of your all budding doctors, an ability of a doctor is not in prescribing the maximum number of drugs. Okay. So what you have been taught and what you have seen around you is anyone saying some symptom, you will prescribe an antibiotic. Even for dengue, diagnosed dengue, you will prescribe an antibiotic. That is not needed. You need to identify why this symptom is occurring. So I will say that in COVID-19, 96% won't require any treatment at all. But having said that, they require monitoring. If they're coming to you, just teach them about the red flag signs. Teach them about how to use the pulse oximeter properly or the single deep breath holding test and all. No point in writing azithromycin or no point in writing zinc, etc. If you want, you can give vitamin C to the patient. That might help them, even though it is not proven in any study. The symptomatic treatment is not azithromycin or giving zinc. Symptomatic treatment means giving antihistamines as well as paracetamol. You should not think that you should give antibiotics to everyone. It is totally unwarranted and it could be harmful as well. Antibiotics can select out for drug-resistant organisms. Keep that in mind.
Sir, I have a doubt.
Please.
Sir, നമ്മുടെ ഗൈഡ് ലൈൻസിൽ മീഥൈൽപ്രെഡ് സ്റ്റിറോയിഡ്സ് ഒക്കെ 5 to 10 days വരെയാണ് കൊടുക്കേണ്ടതെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞു. അപ്പം മോർ ദാൻ 10 days ഹോസ്പിറ്റലൈസേഷൻ കൂടുതലുള്ള ആൾക്ക് അപ്പൊ നമുക്ക് സ്റ്റിറോയിഡ് അപ്പൊ അവർക്ക് സ്റ്റോപ്പ് ചെയ്യണം.
ആക്ച്വലി ഗൈഡ് ലൈൻസ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് അതിന്റെ ഇത് മാർഗദർശി എന്നല്ലേ പറയുന്നത്. ഓക്കെ, protocol is the one which should be followed to the T. Guidelines means there is a scope for individualization. In certain patients, the hypoxia won't improve in 10 days. It is in those patients that we continue with steroids. But our aim must be to give the minimum duration needed of steroids. Okay, നമ്മൾ ഈ പറഞ്ഞ 10 ദിവസം കൊടുക്കണമെന്ന് നിർബന്ധമില്ല. ചില ആൾക്കാർക്ക് നമ്മൾ 5 ദിവസമേ കൊടുക്കത്തുള്ളൂ. Okay, ചില ആൾക്കാർക്ക് that this the ground glassing may progress to fibrosis and all. some patients may require steroids for 1 to 2 months. That is about individualization. That doesn't mean that during the entire stay of hospitalization, patient should be put on steroids. Steroids should be tapered at the earliest. We should be using the minimum dose, possible dose of steroid, which could control hypoxia as well as inflammation.
ഓക്കെ സർ, വൺ മോർ ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ. നമുക്ക് സാർ പറഞ്ഞു വരുന്നത് തന്നെയാണ് ഇപ്പം ഈ ബ്ലൈൻഡ് ആയിട്ട് ആന്റിബയോട്ടിക് യൂസ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. ഇപ്പൊ വാർഡുകളിൽ ഇപ്പം അഡ്മിറ്റ് ആയതിനു ശേഷം ആദ്യം നമ്മൾ ഇടുന്നത് സെഫ്ട്രാക്സോൺ ആണ് ആന്റിബയോട്ടിക് ആയിട്ട്. അപ്പം അതിന്റെ ആവശ്യമില്ലെന്നാണോ സാർ പറയുന്നത്?
അതിന്റെ ആവശ്യമില്ല എന്ന് മാത്രമല്ല, do you think that you will be able to prescribe ceftriaxone for a patient with COVID-19 in any other hospital with a very good antibiotic stewardship committee? നമ്മൾ എബ്രോഡ് പോയി കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ you won't be able to get any antibiotic prescription without authorization from the antibiotic stewardship committee. As youngsters, you should not blindly follow what is being practiced. Okay, you should go by evidence-based guidelines. That I was very happy that in your poster it was mentioned evidence-based guideline. What does evidence say about the secondary bacterial infection in COVID-19 compared to H1N1? The incidence of secondary bacterial infection COVID-19 is actually pretty low. If that is occurring, then give antibiotics. That according to the antibiotic, antibiogram of the hospital. Antibiogram of the hospital means that you should have an idea about the prevalent bugs in your hospital and the sensitivity. Then you should choose an antibiotic. Do you think that ceftriaxone is going to prevent a bacterial superinfection? None of the antibiotics can actually prevent a bacterial superinfection. So for a viral pneumonia, there is no role for antibiotics. Okay, please keep that in mind. നിങ്ങൾ പ്രാക്ടീസ് ചെയ്യുമ്പോഴും ആന്റിബയോട്ടിക് ഇല്ലാതെ തന്നെ പ്രിസ്ക്രൈബ് ചെയ്ത് പ്രാക്ടീസ് ചെയ്യണം. ഓക്കെ
ഓക്കെ ഓക്കെ, താങ്ക് യു സർ, താങ്ക് യു സർ.
This does not apply to immunocompromised host. We are talking about immunocompetent people. Suppose the patient is a renal transplant patient and all, it may not be able to pick up the initial signs of infection. അങ്ങനത്തെ ആൾക്കാർക്കാണ് നമ്മളൊരു കവർ ഓഫ് ആന്റിബയോട്ടിക്സ് കൊടുക്കുന്നത്. സപ്പോസ് എ പേഷ്യന്റ് in the ward is having COVID-19 and suppose the patient is having neutropenia. Suppose the patient is from RCC on chemotherapy. We give ceftriaxone for such patients, no harm. But for immunocompetent, which comprises 99.9% of our patients, antibiotics are not required. നമ്മൾ ഈ ആന്റിബയോട്ടിക്സിനെ പറ്റി പറയുമ്പോഴേ you should read about collateral damage. Okay, so the thing is you will be thinking what is the harm if you take say 5 days of azithromycin? അതല്ലേ ഏറ്റവും വലിയ പ്രോബ്ലം അല്ലേ? നമ്മൾ അതുകൊണ്ട് വേറെ അഡ്വേഴ്സ് ഇവന്റ്സ് ഒന്നും കണ്ടിട്ടില്ല. ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് ദ ഇഷ്യൂ. The hidden adverse event ആണ് collateral damage. So if you are taking an antibiotic, what will happen to your gut microbiota? Okay, your gut microbiota will comprise of your commensal bacteria, which could be good bacteria as well as bad bacteria. Along with that, you will be having candida also, the fungus also. So when we are using broad spectrum antibiotics, all the good bacteria will be killed. Okay, and it will be replaced by drug resistant organisms and candida. And when it gets an opportunity, suppose there is the integrity of the gut is lost and all, you are going to get infection with this drug resistant organism. That is the concept of collateral damage. So all of you should read about the concept of collateral damage. ഈ മ്യൂക്കർമൈക്കോസിസ് സെറ്റിംഗിലും അത് തന്നെയാണ് ആക്ച്വലി പറഞ്ഞത്. അതായത് it is truly multifactorial. The single most reason for mucormycosis occurring more in India, one thing is actually the more number of patients with uncontrolled blood sugar levels and the use of steroids, unscrupulous use of steroids. ഇനി കുറച്ച് ഫാക്ടേഴ്സും കൂടെ ഉണ്ട്. ഇത് പെർസെ അല്ല പറയുന്നത്. Azithromycin കഴിക്കുമ്പോൾ what is going to happen to your nasal epithelium? So you will lose all the colonizing bacteria will be lost. And then you are using the steam inhalation. India steam inhalation ഏറ്റവും കൂടുതൽ യൂസ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. So the Ayush department etc. says that the steam inhalation can prevent COVID from occurring. We know that steam inhalation might help in alleviating the symptoms, but it cannot prevent COVID from occurring. So what will happen when every day you start inhaling steam? ഇപ്പം തന്നെ നമ്മൾ ഇവിടെ കിടക്കുന്ന ENT-യിലെ കിടക്കുന്ന കോവിഡ് അസോസിയേറ്റഡ് മ്യൂക്കർമൈക്കോസിന്റെ അടുത്ത് പോയി ചോദിച്ചാൽ മതി എത്ര ദിവസം സ്റ്റീം ഇൻഹലേഷൻ എടുക്കുമായിരുന്നു. They were doing it 6 to 7 times per day, thinking that it can ward off COVID-19. അപ്പൊ എന്ത് സംഭവിക്കും? because of the latent heat of vaporization, you can have minor scald in your nasal epithelium, minor burns. അപ്പോൾ ആ ബേൺസ് ഉണ്ടായാലും കുഴപ്പമൊന്നുമില്ല. എന്തുകൊണ്ടാ? Our bacteria, colonized bacteria will be there, and if a fungal spore is coming in there, the bacteria will be able to take care of this fungi. പക്ഷെ അസ്ട്രോമൈസിൻ കൊടുക്കുമ്പോൾ എന്ത് സംഭവിക്കും? ആ ബാക്ടീരിയ ഇല്ല. So there is no competition for fungus. So basically in environment, what is happening? There is a survival of the fittest. Inside our body also, the survival of the fittest is there. The fungi are kept in check by the bacteria. So if you are using a broad spectrum antibiotic, you are losing all the bacteria which are capable of containing these fungi. That is lost. Integrity of the nasal epithelium is lost because of the excess of steam inhalation. And even in such a scenario, the fungi will be able to thrive only if it has access to sugar, access to iron, and access to beta hydroxybutyrate. So in hyperglycemia, in diabetic ketoacidosis like situation, we are trying to feed the fungi also. ഇതെല്ലാം ഒരു multifactorial ആണ്. ഇത് ജസ്റ്റ് അസ്ട്രോമൈസിൻ കൊടുത്തിട്ട് മ്യൂക്കർമൈക്കോസിസ് വരുമെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞല്ല. The unscrupulous use of antibiotics can lead to development of drug-resistant organisms, and patient can die because of that. If you look at what is happening in our MDICUs and all, the patients are there in ventilator for say 3 or 4 weeks, and how are they dying? They are dying because of drug-resistant organisms like Acinetobacter, which are sensitive only to polymyxin B and colistin, and Klebsiella, which are sensitive only to colistin. So why is it occurring? It's because of broad-spectrum antibiotics that has been used for the days and years together in the ICU.
ഹലോ സാർ.
Hello.
സാർ, നമുക്ക് ഈ സ്റ്റിറോയിഡ് യൂസ് ചെയ്യുന്ന കാരണം പിന്നെ കോവിഡ് ഇറ്റ്സെൽഫ് കാരണം പേഷ്യന്റ് മൊത്തത്തിൽ ഒരു ന്യൂട്രോ ഫീൽ ചെയ്യും, ലിംബോസൈറ്റ്സിന്റെ ഡെപ്ലീഷൻ ആണല്ലോ കാണുന്നത്. അപ്പൊ നമ്മളൊരു സുപ്രാഡർ ബാക്ടീരിയൽ ഇൻഫെക്ഷൻ വരുവാണെങ്കിൽ എങ്ങനെ ഡയഗ്നോസ് ചെയ്യും?
അവിടെയാണ് ഏറ്റവും വലിയൊരു പ്രോബ്ലം വരുന്നത്. ചിലപ്പോൾ നമുക്ക് when we are using steroids, what will happen is that the neutrophilia will occur and limbocytopenia is occurring, and the total count will go up, and we will think that is due to bacterial infection. മാത്രമല്ല, ഈ സ്റ്റിറോയിഡ് കൊടുക്കുമ്പോൾ ഫീവർ എവിഡന്റ് ആവണമെന്ന് നിർബന്ധമൊന്നുമില്ല. പിന്നെ ഒരു വൈറൽ ന്യൂമോണിയ കിടക്കുമ്പോഴേക്ക് സെക്രീഷൻസ് പുറലന്റ് ആവണമെന്ന് നിർബന്ധമില്ല. സോ അതിൽ വി ക്യാൻ ആക്ച്വലി യൂസ് പ്രോകാൽസ്ട്രോണിൻ. സോ നമ്മളിപ്പോൾ ആന്റിബയോട്ടിക് കൊടുക്കുന്ന മെജോറിറ്റി ഓഫ് ദ പേഷ്യൻസിന് പ്രോകാൽസ്ട്രോണിൻ എലിവേറ്റഡ് ഒന്നും അല്ലല്ലോ. ഓക്കെ, ദാറ്റ് ക്യാൻ ബി ടേക്കൻ ആസ് എ മാർക്കർ ഓഫ് ബാക്ടീരിയൽ ഇൻഫെക്ഷൻ. Second thing is that if the purulence is increasing, the thing is that we are not saying that you should not be using antibiotics. Only thing is that when you are starting a broad spectrum antibiotic like say meropenem or tigecycline, prior to that it is prudent that you should send a blood culture as well as a sputum culture. If that is not growing anything, after say 24 to 48 hours you get the report from automated culture. No, you should stop antibiotics. You should not go behind the counts alone. You assess the patient in toto and decide whether the patient is having or likely to have a bacterial infection and start antibiotics. And once the antibiotic is started, you follow the culture. If the cultures are negative, you have to stop it.
Thank you, sir.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Sir, in methalpredin, the maximum dose is 1 to 2 mg per kg. But 1 gram of body.
ബെനിഫിറ്റ് അല്ല. ഈ പറയുന്നതെന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ ഗൈഡ് ലൈൻസിലൊന്നും ഈ 1 to 2 mg per kg per day കൂടുതൽ കൊടുക്കാൻ പറയുന്നില്ല. പക്ഷേ നമ്മൾ ഇൻഡിവിജ്വലൈസ് ചെയ്ത് നമുക്ക് ഡോസ് ഹൈക്ക് ചെയ്യുന്ന ഒരു ഓപ്ഷൻ ആക്ച്വലി ഉണ്ട്. ഓക്കെ, ഈ പലപ്പോഴും ചെയ്യുന്നത് ഈ ടോസിലിസ്മാബ് നമുക്ക് അവൈലബിൾ ആയിരിക്കില്ല. ഇപ്പം ഈ സ്റ്റിറോയിഡിന്റെ ആ ഡോസിൽ പേഷ്യന്റ് വേഴ്സണിങ് ആണെങ്കിൽ നേരത്തെ പറഞ്ഞ ടോസിലിസ്മാബിന്റെ ഗൈഡ് ലൈൻ സാറ്റിസ്ഫൈ ആണെങ്കിൽ ടോസിലിസ്മാബ് ആണ് ആക്ച്വലി കൊടുക്കേണ്ടത്. പക്ഷെ നമുക്ക് വി ഹാവ് മോർ ആക്സസ് ടു ദ സ്റ്റിറോയിഡ്സ് ദാൻ ടോസിലിസ്മാബ്, ആൻഡ് ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് വൈ നമുക്ക് ഇവിടുത്തെ സിറ്റുവേഷൻ അറിയാമല്ലോ. പേഷ്യന്റ് NIV ആയിരിക്കുകയാണ്. NIV-ന്ന് ഇൻറ്റുബേഷനിലോട്ട് പോയി കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ദ ഔട്ട്കം ഈസ് ഗോയിങ് ടു ബി വെരി ബാഡ്. യു നോ ദാറ്റ്, നോ? ആണല്ലോ. കാരണം ഇൻറ്റുബേറ്റഡ് പേഷ്യന്റിന് 1:1 nursing is a must. Without 1:1 nursing, intubated patients won't come out. That is the truth. Karanam, the endotracheal tube may be malpositioned. It is not a problem with our medical college or our state alone. It has been the problem across the globe. Okay, അക്രോസ് ദ ഗ്ലോബ് ഇനിഷ്യലി ഇൻറ്റുബേഷൻ എല്ലാവർക്കും പേടിയാവാനുള്ള റീസൺ ഇത് തന്നെയായിരുന്നു. വൺസ് എ ട്യൂബ് ഈസ് പുട്ട് ഇൻ, സോ വാട്ട് വിൽ ഹാപ്പൻ, there has to be a nurse along with that patient, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ട്യൂബ് ഔട്ട് ആവും, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ പ്രോൺ ചെയ്യണം. ആക്റ്റീവ് പ്രോണിംഗ് ആണ് നമ്മൾ ഡിസ്കസ് ചെയ്തില്ല. എല്ലാ ഹൈപ്പോക്സിക് പേഷ്യൻസിനും ആക്റ്റീവ് പ്രോണിംഗ്, ഓക്കെ, അവേക്ക് പ്രോണിംഗ് ചെയ്യണം. അവേക്ക് പ്രോണിംഗ് ആക്ച്വലി ക്യാൻ ഇൻക്രീസ് the air entry to the affected lobes. Usually the lower lobes in the superior segments ലാണ് ആദ്യം വരുന്നത്. അവിടെ aeration കിട്ടണമെങ്കിൽ prone പൊസിഷനിലേ പറ്റത്തുള്ളൂ. So if you want to go for this awake proning, okay, if you want to do this proning, the thing is that if the patient is intubated and if you want to do proning and all, there has to be a sister along with that. As 1:1 nursing വേണം. We know that 1:1 nursing ഒരു പാൻഡമിക്കിൽ ഒരിടത്തും കിട്ടത്തില്ല. അപ്പോഴെന്ത് പറ്റും, നമ്മളുടെ ഇൻറ്റുബേഷൻ മേ ബിക്കം ഡിലേഡ് ഇൻറ്റുബേഷൻ. സോ അങ്ങനെ വരുമ്പോൾ വി ട്രൈ ടു സപ്രസ് ദ ഇൻഫ്ലമേഷൻ ടു ആൻ എക്സ്റ്റെന്റ് ടു പ്രിവെന്റ് ഇൻറ്റുബേഷൻ ഫ്രം ഒക്കറിങ്. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് പല ആൾക്കാർക്കും ഹയർ ഡോസ് ഓഫ് സ്റ്റിറോയിഡ്സിലോട്ട് പോകുന്നത്. ഹയർ ഡോസ് ഓഫ് സ്റ്റിറോയിഡ്സ് കിട്ടുന്ന പേഷ്യന്റ് എല്ലാം തന്നെ വി നീഡ് ടു ഫോളോ ദം അപ്പ്. ഈവൻ ഇഫ് ദേ കം ഔട്ട് ഓഫ് COVID-19, they can develop say fungal super infection etc later on, so we need to follow them up properly. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് യൂസ് ചെയ്യുന്നത് കേട്ടോ. 1 gram ഒക്കെ യൂസ് ചെയ്യുന്നതും ഒക്കെ തന്നെ പ്രോട്ടോക്കോളൈസ് ഡോസ് അല്ല. ബട്ട് ഐഡിയൽ പ്രോട്ടോകോൾ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ നമ്മൾ ഈ ഡോസിൽ കൊടുത്തിട്ട് പേഷ്യന്റ് ഇംപ്രൂവ് ചെയ്യുന്നില്ലെങ്കിൽ ഫ്രം NIV വെന്റിലേഷനിൽ പോകണം. വെന്റിലേറ്ററിൽ ഇംപ്രൂവ് ചെയ്യുന്നില്ലെങ്കിൽ ഹാസ് ടു ഗോ ഫോർ ECMO. അപ്പൊ നമുക്കറിയാം നമ്മളുടെ സിനാറിയോയിൽ വെന്റിലേഷൻ ഔട്ട്കം മെ നോട്ട് ബി വെരി ഗുഡ്. നമ്മളുടെ എന്നല്ല, അക്രോസ് ഇന്ത്യ ഇറ്റ് മെ നോട്ട് ബി ഗുഡ്. അതുപോലെ തന്നെ വി ഡോണ്ട് ഹാവ് ആക്സസ് ടു ECMO ഓൾസോ. അപ്പൊ അങ്ങനത്തെ സിറ്റുവേഷനിൽ അവർ എയിം ഈസ് ടു പ്രിവെന്റ് ദ പേഷ്യന്റ് ഫ്രം ഗോയിങ് ഇൻ ടു ദ വെന്റിലേറ്റർ. ആ ഒരു ഘട്ടത്തിലാണ് പലപ്പോഴും ഹയർ ഡോസസ് ഓഫ് സ്റ്റിറോയിഡ്സ് ട്രൈ ചെയ്തത്.
താങ്ക് യു സർ.
മുഹമ്മദ് ആണ് സർ. ഒരു ഡൗട്ട് വെക്കാണ് സർ.
ചോദിച്ചോളൂ.
സർ, ഞാൻ നമ്മുടെ ഈ പല പേഷ്യൻസും, അതായത് നമ്മുടെ റിലേറ്റീവ്സ് പലരും ഈ ഹോം കെയർ, അതായത് കോവിഡ് പോസിറ്റീവ് ആയിട്ട് വീട്ടിൽ ഇരിക്കുന്നവരുണ്ട്. സാച്ചുറേഷൻ ഒക്കെ നോക്കി വലിയ പ്രശ്നമില്ല, ചെറിയ സിംറ്റംസ് ആയിട്ട് ഇരിക്കുന്നവരുണ്ട്. അപ്പൊ അവർക്ക് പലർക്കും എനിക്ക് തോന്നിയിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു ഇൻഫ്ലമേറ്ററി മാർക്കേഴ്സ് ഒന്ന് വിടണം. അപ്പൊ അത് പക്ഷേ കോസ്റ്റിന്റെ പ്രശ്നം കൊണ്ട് പലരും പുവർ ബാക്ക്ഗ്രൗണ്ട് ഉള്ളവരാണെങ്കിൽ രണ്ടോ എണ്ണം ചെയ്താൽ മതി എന്ന് തോന്നുന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ഏതാണ് സാർ ചെയ്യാൻ?
അതില് ഒന്നേ ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റത്തുള്ളെങ്കിൽ ഡൈമർ ചെയ്താൽ മതി.
ഡാബിഗാട്ടനോ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അപ്പിക്സബാൻ എന്തെങ്കിലും തുടങ്ങാം സാർ?
തുടങ്ങാം. എന്ന് വെച്ചാല് നമുക്ക് ആക്ച്വലി ഒരു പേഷ്യന്റിനെ ട്രീറ്റ് ചെയ്യാൻ വേണ്ടി നമുക്ക് ഈവൻ പൾസ് ഓക്സിമീറ്റർ പോലും ഇല്ലാതെ നമുക്ക് ട്രീറ്റ് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റും. ഓക്കെ, പ്രോപ്പർ ആയിട്ട് മറ്റേ എന്തുവാ ഡീപ് ബ്രെത്ത് ഹോൾഡിംഗ് ടെസ്റ്റ് പേഷ്യന്റിനെ പഠിപ്പിച്ചാൽ അത് വെച്ച് നമുക്ക് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റും. നമ്മൾ ഈ ക്ലാസിന്റെ എയിം തന്നെ നമുക്ക് 2 ഡ്രഗ് മാത്രമേ ഒരു പേഷ്യന്റിന് റിയലി സ്റ്റാർട്ട് ചെയ്യേണ്ട കാര്യമുള്ളൂ. ഓക്കെ, സിവിയർ COVID-19 ഒന്ന് സ്റ്റിറോയിഡും 2 ആന്റികോയാഗുലന്റും ആണ്. ബാക്കിയൊക്കെ ബേസിക്കലി മോർട്ടാലിറ്റി ബെനിഫിറ്റ് ഉള്ള ഡ്രഗ്സ് ഒന്നും അല്ല. അപ്പൊ ഹോം കെയർ ഇരിക്കുമ്പോഴും നമ്മള് സ്റ്റിറോയിഡ് സ്റ്റാർട്ട് ചെയ്യാൻ ഇൻഡിക്കേഷൻ ഉണ്ടോ എന്ന് നോക്കുക മാത്രം മതി. അത് എക്സേർഷൻ ഡീസാച്ചുറേഷൻ വെച്ച് കണ്ടുപിടിക്കുക. ചില ആൾക്കാർക്ക് ഡ്രൈ കഫ് കൂടി വരുമ്പോൾ തന്നെ നമുക്കറിയാം, അവർ നടക്കുമ്പോഴേക്കും ഡീസാച്ചുറേറ്റ് ചെയ്യും. അവർക്ക് സ്റ്റിറോയിഡ്സ് സ്റ്റാർട്ട് ചെയ്യാം. നെക്സ്റ്റ് ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ആന്റികോയാഗുലന്റ് വേണോ വേണ്ടതെന്നുള്ളത്. ഹൈപ്പോക്സിയ ഈസ് ആൻ ഇൻഡിക്കേഷൻ ഫോർ ആന്റികോയാഗുലേഷൻ. അതിന്റെ ഡോസ് ഡിസൈഡ് ചെയ്യാനാണ് ഡൈമർ വേണ്ടി വരുന്നത്. ഓക്കെ, അപ്പൊ റിസ്ക് ഫാക്ടേഴ്സ് ഉള്ള ഒരു പേഷ്യന്റ് ആണെങ്കിൽ ഒരു ഇൻവെസ്റ്റിഗേഷൻ ആണ് ചെയ്യേണ്ടെങ്കിൽ യു ഗോ ഫോർ ദ ഡൈമർ. ഓക്കെ, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഹൈപ്പോക്സിയ ഉള്ള എല്ലാവർക്കും റിവറോക്സബാൻ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അപ്പിക്സബാൻ അങ്ങ് സ്റ്റാർട്ട് ചെയ്യുക. അത്രേ ഉള്ളൂ.
പിന്നെ ഒരു ഡൗട്ട്, സ്റ്റിറോയിഡിൽ നമ്മള് പ്രെഡ്നിസോളോണും മീഥൈൽ പ്രെഡ്നിസോളോണൊക്കെ പറയുന്നുണ്ട്. ഓറൽ, ഇപ്പൊ വീട്ടിലായിരിക്കുമ്പോൾ ഓറൽ അല്ലേ കൊടുക്കാൻ പറ്റില്ല. ആണെങ്കിൽ ഡെക്സാമെത്തസോണും പറയുന്നത് പൊട്ടന്റ് ആയതുകൊണ്ട് ഡെക്സാമെത്തസോൺ കൊടുക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ വലിയ ഡോസ് കൂടുതൽ പിൽ ബർഡൻ വരത്തില്ലേ സാർ? അപ്പൊ അത് ഏതാണ് ഏറ്റവും നമുക്ക്?
അത് ആക്ച്വലി നമ്മള് മീഥൈൽ പ്രെഡ്നിസോളോണും വൈസലോണും ആയിരിക്കും പേഷ്യന്റ് കഴിക്കാൻ എളുപ്പം. ഈ ഡെക്സാമെത്തസോൺ 4 milligram ടാബ്ലറ്റ് ചിലപ്പം കിട്ടും കേട്ടോ.
0.5 ആണ് ഫ്രീലി അവൈലബിൾ.
0.5 വെച്ച് കൊടുക്കരുത്. 0.5 വെച്ചിട്ട് കഴിക്കാൻ പറ്റില്ല. 8 milligram എന്ന് പറയും 16 ടാബ്ലറ്റ്. ഡോണ്ട് ഗീവ് ദാറ്റ്. അതിനെക്കാട്ടി മീഥൈൽ പ്രെഡ് 16 BD കൊടുക്കുക, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ വൈസലോൺ 40 OD കൊടുക്കുക.
അപ്പൊ അത് ഷോർട്ട് കോഴ്സ് വെച്ച് സ്റ്റോപ്പ് ചെയ്യണോ അതോ നമ്മൾ
ഒരു 1 week 7 to 10 days. അപ്പൊ 7 days സ്റ്റോപ്പ് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റുമെങ്കിൽ 7 days സ്റ്റോപ്പ് ചെയ്യാം. ഈ വാർഡിൽ കിടക്കുന്ന പല പേഷ്യൻസും വീട്ടിലായിരുന്നെങ്കിൽ അവരുടെ ഗ്ലൈസിമിക് കൺട്രോൾ ബെറ്റർ ആയിരിക്കുമായിരുന്നു തോന്നിയിട്ടുണ്ടോ?
ഒരു പക്ഷേ തോന്നുന്നുണ്ട് സർ.
എക്സാക്ട്ലി. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് നമ്മൾ ഈ എംപവേർഡ് ഹോം കെയറിനെ പറ്റി കൂടുതലായിട്ട് സംസാരിക്കുന്നത്. മനസ്സിലായോ?
പിന്നെ ഒരു പക്ഷേ പലരുടെയും വീട്ടിൽ ഇപ്പം ഗ്ലൂക്കോമീറ്ററും കാര്യങ്ങളൊക്കെ കാണും, അവരുടെ അതിനുള്ള സംവിധാനങ്ങൾ കാണും, വീട്ടിലുള്ള പലരും നോക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. പക്ഷെ ഹോസ്പിറ്റലിൽ നമ്മൾ ഇത്രയും തിരക്ക് പിടിച്ച് കിടക്കുമ്പോൾ എല്ലായിടത്തും നടക്കണമെന്നില്ല.
അത് മാത്രമല്ല ഇപ്പൊ നമ്മളാണെങ്കിൽ പോലും ഉണ്ടല്ലോ, വീട്ടിലൊരു എൻവയോൺമെന്റ് അല്ലേ നമ്മൾ പ്രിഫർ ചെയ്യുന്നത് എപ്പോഴും. ഡെഫിനറ്റ്ലി ഈ ഹൈപ്പോക്സിയ വന്നാൽ മാത്രമേ ഹോസ്പിറ്റലൈസിന്റെ ആവശ്യമുള്ളൂ. ബാക്കിയുള്ള എല്ലാവരും ഒരു പ്രോപ്പർലി മോണിറ്റർ ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റുവാണെങ്കിൽ വീട് തന്നെയാണ് നല്ലത്.
ഹലോ സർ.
ഹലോ ഡെനി.
സാർ, ഒരു ഡൗട്ട് ഉണ്ട്. ഈ ഡെക്സാമെത്തസോൺ ആണോ മീതൽപ്രെഡ് ആണോ നമ്മൾ ഇപ്പൊ ഒരു പേഷ്യന്റ് സിവിയർ സിക്ക് ആണെങ്കിൽ സ്റ്റാർട്ട് ചെയ്യാൻ ബെറ്റർ?
നമുക്ക് അത് അങ്ങനെ പറയാൻ പറ്റില്ല. ഇപ്പോൾ വൈ ഡെക്സാമെത്തസോൺ ഈസ് ഗിവൻ ഇൻ ഓൾമോസ്റ്റ് ഓൾ ദ ഗൈഡ് ലൈൻസ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ റിക്കവറി ട്രയൽ ചോസ് ഡെക്സാമെത്തസോൺ എന്നുള്ളതാണ് എന്ന് മാത്രമേ ഉള്ളൂ. അത് you can use it interchangeably എന്നാണ്. You can either prefer dexamethasone or use methylprednisolone. You can't say which is better.
Okay sir.
Pregnancy reasons മനസ്സിലായല്ലോ അല്ലേ? Why we are choosing methylprednisolone in first trimester and dexa followed by methylprednisolone in third trimester. അത് മനസ്സിലായല്ലോ?
മനസ്സിലായി സർ.
Okay. Any other questions?
സാർ, ഒരു ക്വസ്റ്റ്യനും കൂടെ. ഈ കൺവാലസന്റ് പ്ലാസ്മ നമ്മൾ ആദ്യത്തെ കോവിഡ് വേവിന്റെ ആ സമയങ്ങളിൽ നമ്മൾ ഉപയോഗിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. പിന്നെ ശേഷം അത് ഡ്രോപ്പ് ആയി. അപ്പൊ അതിന് കാരണം എന്താണെന്ന് പറയാമോ സാർ?
അത് ബേസിക്കലി നമ്മുടെ ട്രയൽസിലെ ഇന്ത്യയിൽ തന്നെ പ്ലാൻസിഡ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ ട്രയൽ നടത്തി. അതിലൊന്നും തന്നെ ബെനിഫിറ്റ് കണ്ടില്ല. ഒരു റീസൺ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ ഒരു കോൺകോവിഡ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ ഒരു ട്രയലിൽ നെതർലാൻഡ്സ് നടത്തിയതാണ്. അപ്പൊ ഈ കൺവാലസന്റ് പ്ലാസ്മ ഹാസ് ടു ബി അഡ്മിനിസ്ട്രേഡ് ഡ്യൂറിംഗ് ദ first 7 days, that is during the phase of viral replication. So we don't want to administer it during the phase of cytokine storm. So in that trial, all the patients who were enrolled, so at the time of enrollment itself, they checked the antibody titer of those patients. Antibody was positive. The antibody is positive, there is no point in giving convalescent plasma. So the trial was dropped. Then the PLACID trial was done by ICMR. It was the largest RCT done on convalescent plasma. Okay, and around 46 centers were involved, and they also found that convalescent plasma cannot prevent the progression to severe disease. Okay, it cannot prevent the progression to severe disease, and majority of the recipients already had antibodies. So they said that convalescent plasma does not have any benefit. US FDA says that convalescent plasma has benefit only in one particular patient category. That is in immunocompromised individuals. Immunocompromised individuals who won't be able to generate an antibody response. So how will we identify the immunocompromised individuals? Okay, the patient is having HIV or say a post-transplant. Such a patient is coming within 7 days. So you check the antibody level. If it is negative, then you check the antibody titer of the donor. Okay, you can look at the neutralizing titer if it is more than 1 in 80, or you look at the CLIA, that's chemiluminescent assay, which is more than 13 AU. Then select that high titer plasma from the donor and infuse it to that immunocompromised patient. So that option is there in US FDA now for immunocompromised patients. But on a whole, it is actually a futile exercise giving convalescent plasma. Moreover, there are speculations that the use of convalescent plasma is tied to the genesis of these mutants. Okay, the mutant coronavirus. So we should not be doing something which is not beneficial but can lead to generation of the variants of interest or variants of concern. So convalescent plasma has no role in the treatment of COVID-19 now.
ഓക്കെ സാർ. സാർ, പിന്നെ ഒരു സംശയം കൂടെ ഉണ്ട്. നമ്മൾ ഈ NIV അല്ലാണ്ട് ഇൻറ്റുബേഷൻ നമ്മൾ കൂടുതൽ പ്രൊമോട്ട് ചെയ്യുന്നില്ല. അതിന്റെ കാരണം കൂടെ ഒന്ന് പറഞ്ഞു തരാമോ സാർ?
Actually, the guidelines vechittu, if the patient is not, if we start with NRBM and then we proceed to high flow nasal oxygen, and then if the patient is not improving, we proceed to NIV. And ideally, the critical care guidelines say that if the patient is not improving, within say 2 to 4 hours of an NIV trial, you should go for intubation and ventilation. Okay. If you look at, I'm not going to talk about our institution. Okay. If you take the case of any ICU, the patients on NIV, say a 20-bedded ICU, there may be around say 10 patients on NIV, and around 8 patients won't improve on after 4 hours of NIV. So what should be done? 8 patients should be intubated and ventilated. Now, if you are intubating 8 patients, you require 1:1 nursing. So without 1:1 nursing, what will happen? The endotracheal tube may come out, and then you need to do the proning also, because proning is a very, very important part of patient care. In order to prone and to ensure that the ET tube is not getting displaced, you require a dedicated nurse by the bedside. You know the situation of the resources, the nursing resources, etc. You know. Because of that reason, in many centers, doctors are very hesitant to intubate the patient. But in an ideal setting, if you can ensure that you have a nurse at least for 2 intubated patients, then ideally, if the patient is not improving within 4 hours of the NIV trial, you should go for intubation and ventilation.
Okay, sir.
പക്ഷേ ഇന്റിബേറ്റ് ചെയ്തിട്ട് നോക്കാൻ ആളില്ലെങ്കിലേ ഇറ്റ് മേ ബി കൗണ്ടർ പ്രൊഡക്റ്റീവ്.
ഇവിടെ മനസ്സിലായി സർ.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
Sir, one more question, sir. Actually, you said that altered sensorium in COVID-19 may be due to decreased cerebral perfusion, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sir, my doubt is there any chance of development of viral encephalitis in COVID-19?
Definitely, it's possible.
So, for an early detection of viral encephalitis, can you say some hallmark signs in COVID-19?
Actually, the thing is, COVID-19 is a neurotropic virus. Okay, because the ACE2 receptors are present in the blood-brain barrier and can get into the brain. That is why you're having so many neurological manifestations. Need not be encephalitis per se. You can have the stroke syndromes. You can have the ADAP, encephalomyelitis. You can have the anosmia, just because of the involvement of the olfactory epithelium. You can have the dysgeusia as well as the agusia as well. I mentioned that in context of empowered home care. Okay. Empowered home care means the any patient complaining of alteration of sensory, it could be due to many reasons. It could be because of cerebral hypoperfusion. It could be because of encephalitis. It could be because of an electrolyte disturbance also. But then any patient in home care who is complaining of this thing has to be hospitalized. That is what I said. Okay. Now the point is towards an encephalitis is, one is alteration of sensorium. Second is seizure. Usually in encephalitis there will be seizure. So any patient complaining alteration of sensorium plus seizures in the setting of COVID-19, if electrolytes are normal, think in terms of a encephalitis. It can also be due to the presence of a cerebral venous thrombosis. Okay, encephalitis is not a very rare occurrence in COVID-19 because it is a neurotropic virus. Okay.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
It is not easy to prove encephalitis because for that we should be doing the PCR in CSF. Yeah, we are not doing that because ICMR has not validated that.
Okay, sir.
Any other questions? Whatever you want, you can ask. Okay. So as young doctors, you should learn to question. Okay, you should not blindly follow whatever is being written in the case sheets, whatever the MOs are saying. You should not be blindly following, because you have access to everything in the world. Now you can cross check with NIH guidelines. Everything is in your palm top only. Just search and you can get whatever information you want to get. And if you are saying that ivermectin has to be used, then you should ask why, what is evidence for ivermectin? So you should actually, from MBBS days onwards, you should have that attitude. The questioning attitude should be there. You should ask the right questions. That doesn't mean that you should not listen to seniors and all, because experience also is very important. That is what the COVID-19 taught us. All the European countries waited for the recovery trial to start steroids, whereas we followed our experience, because in our experience, even for measles and all those on NIV, we use steroids, and that actually prevents the progression to the ARDS, and we could avoid intubation and ventilation such patients. So when there is not adequate evidence, experience definitely help. So you need to listen to your seniors, but then you should ask questions. When you should not take everything at face value. You should learn to ask questions, and you should, if you are not getting the right answer, ask the next person.
So I do have one question. Can I please ask that?
Yeah, definitely.
So in the periphery, what I've seen commonly is that when patients end up being COVID positive, and most of them fall into either category A or maybe category, the starting stage of category with the comorbidity present. In addition to COVID, we usually send them for home quarantine for 17 days in the present aspect. So the most common doubt that I've faced is they all ask whether they can continue the medications that they are on right now. So with respect to this,
they can continue the medications they are on. Yeah.
No, sir. What I meant was specifically ARBs and ACE inhibitors in respect to hypertension. Sir.
Definitely, they can continue AC and ARB. That is a recommendation. Okay, they can continue AC and ARB, and that is why I mentioned in the first slide. Because AC, when we are using AC inhibitors, the AC2 receptors may be more expressed, but that does not mean that the virus it will be easier for the virus to get in, because the other receptor, the TMPRSS2, is not expressed in more amounts in those who are on AC or ARB. Both the receptors are required. The guidelines are to continue AC and ARB. You should continue that. But if the patient is developing, say, acute kidney injury or something like that, definitely because hyperkalemia and all, you may have to alter. But your question is, if you are sending a patient on for home quarantine, can they continue AC or ARB? They should continue that.
Thank you.
Hello, sir.
Any more questions?
Hello, sir.
Hello, I can hear you. Go on.
Sir, MD നമ്മൾ usually after 5 days അല്ലേ സ്റ്റാർട്ട് ചെയ്യാൻ പറയുന്നത്. പക്ഷെ ഒരുപാട് കേസസിൽ ഈ വൈറൽ മൾട്ടിപ്ലിക്കേഷൻ പീരീഡിൽ തന്നെ നമ്മൾ സ്റ്റാർട്ട് ചെയ്യുന്നുണ്ട്. അങ്ങനെ സ്റ്റാർട്ട് ചെയ്യുന്നുണ്ട് കുഴപ്പമുണ്ടോ?
നമ്മൾ ആക്ച്വലി ഈ 5 days എന്ന് പറയുന്ന മിസ്യൂസ് വരാതിരിക്കാൻ വേണ്ടിയാണ്. ഓക്കെ, അതായത് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഫ്രം ഡേ 2 onwards everyone will start the patient on budesonide. MDA എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ it has to be budesonide alone. It should not be a combination of a sympathomimetic plus budesonide. കാരണം അങ്ങനെയാണെങ്കിൽ ടാക്കിക്കാർഡിയയിലോട്ട് പോകാൻ ചാൻസ് ഉണ്ട്. There is a subtle myocarditis in COVID-19. Okay, even in asymptomatic patients, subtle myocarditis may be there. So we don't want to use any salbutamol or salmeterol or formoterol containing combinations. Then why we are saying 5 days? കാരണം majority of the patients symptoms may subside within 3 to 4 days. ആ സമയത്ത് സ്റ്റാർട്ട് ചെയ്യേണ്ട കാര്യമില്ല. പക്ഷേ നമുക്ക് ഈ കുറെ പേഷ്യൻസിനെ കണ്ടാൽ അറിയാം, കുത്തി ഇങ്ങനെ ചുമ തുടങ്ങി വന്നാലേ അപ്പോഴേ നമുക്കറിയാം ഇൻഡസ്ട്രിയൽ ഇൻവോൾവ്മെന്റ് ആണ്. അത്തരം പേഷ്യൻസ് നേരത്തെ സ്റ്റാർട്ട് ചെയ്താലും കുഴപ്പമില്ല.
സർ, ഈ കോവിഡ് പ്രിവെന്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നതിൽ സ്റ്റീം ഇൻഹലേഷൻ എന്തെങ്കിലും റോൾ ഉണ്ടോ?
റോളില്ല, അതാണ് പറഞ്ഞത്. റോളില്ല. ചിലപ്പോഴും മ്യൂക്കർ മൈക്കോസിസ് ഫ്രീ ആയിട്ട് കിട്ടാനും സാധ്യതയുണ്ട്.
ഓക്കെ സർ, താങ്ക് യു.
ഈ സ്റ്റീം ഇൻഹലേഷൻ റോള് വരുന്നത്, if you are symptomatic, you are having nasal congestion, etc., then steam inhalation will help you. But if you are having uncontrolled diabetes, you are on high dose of steroids, it is better not to use steam inhalation. If you are an immunocompetent with no other issues, nasal congestion, you can use steam inhalation. There is no harm. It is actually for a symptom relief. It is not to prevent COVID-19. Any other questions?
Sir, hemoptysis ഉള്ള ഒരു പേഷ്യന്റിന് നമ്മൾ ആന്റികോagulation സ്റ്റാർട്ട് ചെയ്യും.
That means hemoptysis is a red flag sign, but hemoptysis can occur because of pulmonary embolism also. So we need to see why the patient is developing hemoptysis. Okay. If the hemoptysis, all the patients with hemoptysis, we usually take the CT scan, and if there is evidence of pulmonary embolism, you need to anticoagulate and you need to continue on anticoagulation. But if there is no evidence of embolism, then what we do is we wait for 2 days, and once the hemoptysis settle, then we'll continue with anticoagulation if it is needed based on the D-dimer levels. ഇതിനെക്കാട്ടി പ്രോബ്ലം ആണ് മെനറേജിയ കേട്ടോ. മെനറേജിയയിൽ വാട്ട് വിൽ യു ഡു എന്നുള്ളതാണ് റിയൽ ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ. ഇറ്റ്സ് എ ബിഗ് ഇഷ്യൂ. കാരണം അവിടെ ട്രനെക്സ കൊടുക്കേണ്ടി വരും. സോ വിൽ യു ഗീവ് ട്രനെക്സ ഫോർ എ പേഷ്യന്റ് വിത്ത് COVID-19? അപ്പോൾ ഇൻഡിവിജ്വലൈസ് ചെയ്യേണ്ടി വരും. ഓൾ ദ പേഷ്യൻസ് വിത്ത് COVID-19 ആർ നോട്ട് അറ്റ് റിസ്ക് ഓഫ് ഡെവലപ്പിംഗ് ഈ ത്രോംബോ എംബോളിസം. So the patient is not hypoxic, the patient does not require that. Look at the D-dimer. Atharam situationally you have to individualize.
Thank you, sir.
Hello, I can hear you.
Sorry, COVID-19 മീതൽപ്രെഡ് 60 mg ഓടി പോകുന്ന പേഷ്യന്റ് ആണെങ്കിൽ നമ്മൾ സ്റ്റിറോയിഡ് ഓറൽ ടേപ്പറിംഗ് ഡോസ് എങ്ങനെയാ?
ടേപ്പറിംഗ് ഡോസ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് നമ്മള് ഈ എന്നുവെച്ചാൽ വീട്ടിൽ വിടാൻ പോവാണോ?
അതെ സാർ, വീട്ടിലോട്ട് വിടാണ്.
വീട്ടിൽ എത്ര ദിവസം എടുത്തു? 60 ഓടി
5 days.
5 days എടുത്തു അല്ലേ? അപ്പം ആക്ച്വലി മീൻസ് ഹൈപ്പോക്സി ഒന്നും ഇപ്പൊ ഇല്ലല്ലോ അല്ലേ?
ഇല്ല, ഇപ്പൊ റൂമേല് 94 above ഉണ്ട്.
അപ്പൊ 16 BD വെച്ച് വിട്ടാൽ മതി. 16 BD 32 ഓടി 16 mg 101 into നെക്സ്റ്റ് 5 days കൊടുത്ത് വിട്ടാൽ മതി.
അത്ര മതി. ഓക്കെ.
ഹലോ സർ.
ഹലോ, പറഞ്ഞോളൂ.
സർ, ഒരു ഡൗട്ട് ചോദിക്കാം സർ. കോവിഡിൽ കൂടുതലും ഇൻഡസ്ട്രീഷ്യൽ ഇൻവോൾവ്മെന്റ് അല്ലേ പ്രിഡോമിനന്റ്ലി? പക്ഷേ ഇൻഹേൽഡ് ബ്യൂട്ടസനൈഡിന്റെ റോള് വന്നത് എങ്ങനെയാ? എയർവേ ഇൻവോൾവ്മെന്റ്?
അത് ആക്ച്വലി തുടക്കത്തിൽ എയർവേ ഇൻവോൾവ്മെന്റിലല്ലേ സ്റ്റാർട്ട് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. നേരത്തെ ഞാൻ കാണിച്ചില്ലേ, എയർവേയുടെ എല്ലാ പാർട്ടും ഇൻവോൾവ് ആണ്. ഇത് ഒരു സ്റ്റോയിക് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ ഒരു ട്രയലില് ബേസ്ഡ് ആണ്. എന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ ആ ട്രയലിൽ ആക്ച്വലി 197 പാർട്ടിസിപ്പൻസേ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നുള്ളൂ. That could prevent the progression to moderate disease എന്ന് വെച്ചാണ് ഹിസ്റ്റോറിക് ട്രയലിൽ ബിഡിസനൈഡ് കൊടുത്തത്. ദാറ്റ് ഹൈ ഡോസ് ആണ്. നമ്മൾ 200 ഒക്കെ അല്ലേ കിട്ടുന്നത്, 800 BD കൊടുക്കാനാണ് പറഞ്ഞിരിക്കുന്നത്. അത് കൂടാതെ there is another trial in the pre-print stage. That's from the Oxford group. It's a principal trial. They looked at around 4,800 patients. അതിലും early initiation of budesonide എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ 5 days symptom ഉണ്ടെങ്കിൽ if you are starting budesonide, probably you can prevent the progression to severe disease എന്നാണ് പറയുന്നത്. അങ്ങനെയാണ് വന്നത്. അത് ഇൻഡസ്ട്രീഷ്യൽ എത്തിയ ശേഷം സ്റ്റാർട്ട് ചെയ്യാനല്ല ഉദ്ദേശിക്കുന്നത് കേട്ടോ. So once you develop interstitial pneumonia and exertion desaturation, it is time to add oral steroids.
Okay sir, thank you sir.
Sir, ഈ മോണോക്ലോണൽ ആന്റിബോഡീസ് ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്ന ഒന്നുകൂടെ ഒന്ന് പറഞ്ഞുതരാമോ സർ?
ആക്ച്വലി നമ്മൾ ഈ മോണോക്ലോണൽ ആന്റിബോഡീസ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ ഇപ്പം നമുക്ക് അവൈലബിൾ ആണ്, കേരളത്തിലും അവൈലബിൾ ആണ്. ഈ കെസരിവിമാബ് പ്ലസ് ഇൻഡിവിമാബ് എന്ന് പറയുന്ന സാധനം, അത് 600 mg 600 mg കോമ്പിനേഷൻ. അപ്പൊ ഇത് നമ്മൾ കൊടുക്കുന്നതെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാലേ, മോണോക്ലോണൽ ആന്റിബോഡി മീൻസ് ദാറ്റ് when you are getting infection before you develop hypoxia, this is a stage of viral replication വെച്ച് തന്നെ you are giving antibodies to the patient so that these antibodies will be able to neutralize the virus. Viral replication will stop. So such patients won't progress to severe disease എന്നാണ്. ഓക്കെ, അപ്പൊ ഇത് ആർക്കാണ് കൊടുക്കേണ്ടതെന്ന് ചോദിച്ചു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് വെരി എക്സ്പെൻസീവ്. മാത്രമല്ല ഇത് ഷോർട്ട് സപ്ലൈ ഉള്ള സാധനമായിരിക്കും. അപ്പൊ ദോസ് പേഷ്യൻസ് ഹു ആർ ലൈക്ലി ടു പ്രോഗ്രസ് ടു സിവിയർ ഡിസീസ്, അപ്പൊ അവർ പറയുന്ന അനുസരിച്ച് ഏജ് അബോവ് 60, CKD, CLD, അൺകൺട്രോൾ ഡയബറ്റീസ്, ഒബേസിറ്റി അങ്ങനെയൊക്കെയാണ്. അങ്ങനെ നോക്കുമ്പോൾ ഇറ്റ് വിൽ ബി ഹ്യൂജ് ചങ്ക്. So what we can say is, say a patient, post-transplant patient, if they develop COVID-19, they are likely to die. We know. A leukemia patient, if they develop transplant, COVID, they are likely to die. A CKD on dialysis, our experience, they are likely to die. So then those patients with a body mass index say more than 40 or say 35, if they develop the disease, they are likely to require NIV or ventilation. ഇങ്ങനെ ഹാൻഡ് പിക്ക് ചെയ്തിട്ട് ഇത്തരം ആൾക്കാർക്ക് സിംറ്റം തുടങ്ങുന്ന സമയത്ത് തന്നെ ഹൈപ്പോക്സിയ വന്നിട്ട് കൊടുത്തിട്ട് കാര്യമില്ല. ഹൈപ്പോക്സിയ വന്നിട്ട് കൊടുത്തു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ഇറ്റ് ക്യാൻ റിസൾട്ട് ഇൻ സൈറ്റോകൈൻ സ്റ്റോം ലൈക്ക് സിറ്റുവേഷൻ. സോ actually during the phase of viral replication, you give these monoclonal antibodies as an IV infusion or subcutaneous injection. Okay, ഒറ്റ ഡോസ് മതി. And these neutralizing antibodies can inhibit the viral replication. That is the mechanism of monoclonal antibodies. Donald Trumpന് കൊടുത്തില്ലേ, അതൊക്കെ ഇതാ.
Okay, sir.
Clear ആയോ?
Clear ആയി sir, clear ആയി sir.
The problem എന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ NNT എന്ന് പറയുന്ന സംഭവമുണ്ട്, നമ്പർ നീഡഡ് ടു ട്രീറ്റ് ടു പ്രിവെന്റ് വൺ ഹോസ്പിറ്റലൈസേഷൻ. ഇത് ഔട്ട് പേഷ്യന്റ് ആയിട്ട് കൊടുക്കേണ്ട ഡ്രഗ് ആണ് കേട്ടോ. The aim is to prevent hospitalization and severe disease. So the number needed to treat to prevent one hospitalization is 45. Okay, അതായത് 45 high risk ആൾക്കാർക്ക് ഈ monoclonal antibody കൊടുക്കുമ്പോൾ you will be able to prevent one hospitalization, or the cost to prevent one hospitalization is going to be 27 lakh rupees. But having said that, suppose your very close friend is morbidly obese and he is developing fever and cough, and the rat is positive, and you are afraid that he will progress to severe disease. The best thing to do is to give monoclonal antibody.
Okay, sir.
Any further questions?
If there are no further questions, we can aim to wrap this session up. ഇതിപ്പം 2 മണിക്കൂർ മാർക്ക് അടിച്ചു കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട്. If there are any more questions, please do. So I think there are no more questions. I'd like to thank you again. സാറിന്റെ വിലപ്പെട്ട സമയം ഇത്രയധികം നമ്മളോടൊപ്പം ചെലവഴിച്ചതിനും സാറിന്റെ ഈ ഒരു ബിസി ഷെഡ്യൂളിൽ നിന്ന് ഈ സമയം മാറ്റി വെച്ച് ഞങ്ങളുടെ കോവിഡിനെ ചികിത്സിക്കാനുള്ള അറിവിലേക്ക് ആഡ് ചെയ്യുന്നു. താങ്ക് യു അഗൈൻ. ആൻഡ് സർ, we have also recorded the class, so we'll be putting this up. We'll be sharing the link soon. മിസ്സായിട്ടുള്ള ആരെങ്കിലും ഉണ്ട്, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ആദ്യത്തെ കുറച്ച് ഭാഗങ്ങൾ കാണാത്ത ആരെങ്കിലും ഉണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ആ ലിങ്ക് വഴി ആക്സസ് ചെയ്യാവുന്നതായിരിക്കും. സാർ ഇപ്പം യൂസ് ചെയ്ത സ്ലൈഡ്സ് ഷെയർ ചെയ്യണമെങ്കിൽ we'll try sharing this.
Yeah, definitely I will share it. No, you can send your email ID.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.